On the 9th of June, in the year 68 of the Common Era, a man sat in the dark and listened to himself die. The villa was modest by imperial standard, a freedman's country house tucked into the hills northeast of Rome, surrounded by laurel and olive groves that rustled in the pre-dawn air. The lamps had burned low. The walls painted in the provincial style with scenes of rustic life, shepherds, vines, a quiet river, were barely visible in the guttering light. Somewhere outside, a horse shifted its weight in the courtyard. Somewhere beyond that, on the road from Rome, riders were coming. The man was 30 years old. His body had thickened in recent years, gone soft in the way that bodies do when they are fed without restraint and moved without purpose. His neck was fleshy, his face bloated, his eyes, which had once been described as dull blue, slightly myopic, carrying a permanent squint that lent him an expression somewhere between cunning and confusion, were red-rimmed from weeping. He wore a tunic stained from hard riding and a cloak he had pulled over his head to avoid being recognized on the road. His feet, once shod in gilded sandals, were scratched and dirty. He had ridden through thorn bushes in the dark. An earthquake had shaken the ground beneath him as he fled. He had taken these things as omens. In his hand, or near it, was a dagger. He had been holding it for hours, pressing the point against his skin, withdrawing it, pressing again. He could not do it. He had ordered the deaths of dozens of men and women, his mother, his wife, his former tutor, senators and freedmen and strangers whose names he never learned, but he could not perform this final, simplest act upon himself. He kept murmuring a phrase over and over in Greek, the language he preferred for moments of self-pity and self-dramatization. The phrase, according to multiple sources who could not have been present but who reported it with remarkable consistency, was this: Qualis artifex perio. What an artist dies in me. Not what an emperor. Not what a god or a general or a Roman, an artist. In his last hours on earth, with the dynasty of Augustus collapsing around him like a theater set struck after the final performance, the man who had ruled the known world for 14 years identified himself not by his power, but by his singing voice. Not by the legions he commanded, but by the lyre he played. Not by the empire he had inherited, but by the poetry he had composed, the roles he had performed on stage, the standing ovations he had received, or commanded, in theaters from Rome to Greece. The horseman drew closer. His freedman, a man named Epaphroditus, stood nearby. The dagger trembled. His name was Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, and the empire he left behind, the civilization that would shape the legal, linguistic, architectural, and political foundations of the Western world for the next 2,000 years, would remember him as a monster, a matricide, an arsonist, a tyrant who fiddled while his capital burned, who fed Christians to dogs in his gardens, who murdered his pregnant wife with a kick to the stomach and castrated a boy to make him a substitute bride. His name would become, in every European language, a synonym for the kind of ruler who makes civilized people ashamed of civilization itself. And yet, the sources disagree. The timeline contradicts itself. The most damning stories emerged decades after his death, written by men who served the dynasty that replaced him and who had every reason to blacken his memory. The common people of Rome, the ones who did not write histories, who did not sit in the Senate, who did not own the villas where policy was debated over honeyed wine, mourned him. For decades after his death, flowers appeared on his grave. Impostors claiming to be Nero, risen from the dead, attracted massive followings in the eastern provinces. The Parthian king, Rome's great rival, reportedly wept at the news of Nero's fall and honored his memory for years. The most hated emperor in Roman history was also, it seems, the most missed. This is the story of how a boy born to a family that consumed its own became the ruler of the most powerful state on earth. How the same qualities that made his early reign a model of good governance, sensitivity, intelligence, a genuine desire to be loved, curdled under the pressures of absolute power into cruelty, paranoia, and self-destruction. It is a story about what happens when a person who wants to be an artist is made an emperor instead, and about what happens to an empire when it discovers that the machinery of autocracy once built has no mechanism for removing the autocrat. It is also a story about sources, about who wrote the history and why, and what they chose to include, and what they might have invented. Because the Nero we think we know, the fiddling pyromaniac, the bloated sadist, is largely a literary construction, built from the accounts of men who hated him for reasons that were not always the reasons they claimed. To understand Nero, we must first understand the men who destroyed his memory. And to understand them, we must understand the world that produced them all. Before we enter the narrative, a word about how we know what we think we know. The problem with Nero is not a shortage of sources. It is an overabundance of hostile ones. 3 ancient historians provide the bulk of our information, and all 3 wrote after Nero's death, under emperors who had an active political interest in making the previous dynasty look as terrible as possible. The first is Tacitus, who composed his Annals sometime around the year 116 cipher, roughly 50 years after Nero's death. Tacitus is the finest prose stylist of all the Roman historians, a man capable of compressing an entire moral judgment into a subordinate clause, and he is also among the most bitter. He served under the Emperor Domitian, a ruler whose reign of terror gave Tacitus a lifelong allergy to autocracy in all its forms. His account of Nero is detailed, psychologically acute, and written with the controlled fury of a man who has watched absolute power corrupt absolutely and wants to make certain his readers feel the full weight of the degradation. He is brilliant. He is also not neutral. He had his own agenda, his own aristocratic biases, his own reasons for selecting certain anecdotes and omitting others. The second is Suetonius, who wrote his Lives of the 12 Caesars around the year 121. Suetonius was a secretary to the Emperor Hadrian, which gave him access to the imperial archives, letters, documents, administrative records that no other historian could consult. His portrait of Nero is organized not chronologically but thematically by vice. Nero's cruelty, Nero's lust, Nero's extravagance, Nero's artistic pretensions, each cataloged with the methodical precision of a clerk filling out a charge sheet. Suetonius is invaluable for specific details, dates, names, physical descriptions, quoted speech, but he is essentially a gossip columnist with archival access. He collects scandals. He does not evaluate them. He presents the rumor that Nero set fire to Rome and the evidence that he did not side by side without indicating which he finds more convincing. The third is Cassius Dio, a Greek senator who wrote his Roman history nearly a century and a half after Nero's death, around the year 230. Dio's account survives mostly in fragments and later summaries, and it is the most openly hostile of the 3. Where Tacitus is surgical and Suetonius is clinical, Dio is theatrical. His Nero is a cartoon villain, a figure of pure grotesquerie, and while some of his unique details may preserve genuine traditions lost in other sources, the distance of his writing from the events he describes makes every claim harder to verify. Beyond these 3, we have scattered references in Pliny the Elder, Josephus, the philosopher Seneca, who was Nero's own tutor and later his victim, and the physical evidence, inscriptions, coins, archaeological remains from Nero's palace and from the rebuilding of Rome after the fire. Modern scholarship has added tools that the ancient historians lacked. Dendrochronology, which can date wooden structures to the year of their construction. Numismatic analysis, which tracks economic policy through the metal content of coins. And the careful cross-referencing of provincial records from Egypt, Judea, and Britain that sometimes tell a different story than the one being told in Rome. What emerges from all of this is not a simple portrait. It is a palimpsest. Layer upon layer of narrative, each shaped by the political needs of its author, each preserving fragments of truth inside structures of interpretation. The Nero of Tacitus is not the Nero of Suetonius. And neither is the Nero of the provincial inscriptions, where he appears as a competent administrator whose reforms were appreciated by people who never met him. Somewhere beneath these competing versions, a real person existed. He made real decisions. He caused real suffering. He also, for the first 5 years of his reign, governed well enough that the period was later cited as a model of good rule by emperors who despised his memory. We will try to find that person. We will not always succeed. Where the sources permit confidence, we will speak with confidence. Where they do not, and they often do not, likewise we will say so and proceed with care. To understand Nero, you must first understand the family that made him. And to understand the family, you must understand the system that made the family. The Roman Empire of the first century was, in constitutional theory, not an empire at all. It was a republic. The same republic that had overthrown its kings 5 centuries earlier and had in the popular mythology of every educated Roman established the principle that no single man should hold permanent, unchecked power over the state. The Senate still met. The magistrates still held their annual offices. The legal forms of republican governance were observed with meticulous care, but the forms were a shell. Inside them, since the year 27 before the Common Era, a single family had held effective control of the Roman state, its armies, its treasury, and its foreign policy. The mechanism was not a crown or a throne. Romans would have found those symbols repulsive, but an accumulation of republican titles and powers concentrated in one person: imperator, princeps, Augustus, pontifex maximus. Each title was individually a traditional republican honor. Held together in the same hands for life, they constituted something no Roman would have recognized as a monarchy, but which functioned as one in every way that mattered. The first man to hold this accumulation was Gaius Octavius, who took the name Augustus and ruled for 41 years, from 27 before the Common Era to 14 of it. Augustus was a political genius of the first order. Cold, methodical, capable of extraordinary patience and extraordinary violence in roughly equal measure. He understood something that his adoptive father Julius Caesar had not: that the Roman aristocracy would tolerate a king, provided you never called yourself one. He wrapped absolute power in the language of restoration, presented himself as the defender of tradition rather than its destroyer, and built a system so effective that it survived the deaths of its competent operators and continued functioning even in the hands of the incompetent and the insane. This was the system's great achievement. It was also its fatal flaw, because Augustus, for all his genius, never solved the problem of succession. The Republic had transferred power through annual elections, monarchies transferred power through hereditary right. Augustus's system was neither. It was a military autocracy disguised as a civilian republic. And the question of who came next was answered not by law, but by a combination of adoption, dynastic maneuvering, and the approval of the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers stationed in Rome, whose loyalty to the emperor was personal, not constitutional. The emperor chose his successor by adopting him. The Senate ratified the choice. The Guard enforced it. And if any of these mechanisms failed, if the emperor died without a clear heir, or if the heir was unacceptable to the Guard, or if a provincial army decided it preferred its own general, the result was civil war. The family that held this precarious monopoly on power for nearly a century was the Julio-Claudian dynasty, named for its 2 founding lineages: the Julii, who traced their descent from the goddess Venus through Julius Caesar, and the Claudii, one of Rome's oldest and most distinguished patrician families. By the time of Nero's birth, these 2 lines had intermarried so thoroughly that the family tree resembled less a tree than a tangle of roots growing back into themselves. Uncles married nieces, cousins married cousins. Adoptions blurred the lines between generations so completely that the same man could be simultaneously a person's stepfather, great-uncle, and adoptive grandfather. This was not accident, it was policy. The pool of people with legitimate claims to the principate had to remain small enough to control, and the only way to keep it small was to keep it in the family. The result was a dynasty that concentrated not only power but pathology, a closed system in which ambition, paranoia, and the particular psychological pressures of absolute authority circulated without dilution from one generation to the next. Augustus himself, beneath the marble calm of his public image, was a man who had ordered proscriptions, the legal murder of political enemies, on a scale that shocked even his contemporaries. His successor Tiberius retreated to the island of Capri in the last decade of his reign and governed the empire by letter, while, according to sources that may or may not be reliable, indulging in sexual practices that Suetonius describes in detail sufficient to make the reader wish he had not. After Tiberius came Caligula, Nero's uncle, who ruled for 4 years with a volatility that may have been genuine madness or may have been the behavior of a young man testing the limits of power that turned out to have no limits. Caligula was assassinated by his own guards in the year 41, stabbed 30 times in a palace corridor, and the guards then went looking for the next emperor and found him hiding behind a curtain. That man was Claudius, Nero's future stepfather, the man behind the curtain. Claudius was 50 years old when the Praetorian Guard dragged him from his hiding place and declared him emperor. He had survived the reigns of Tiberius and Caligula by being or appearing to be harmless, a stammering, limping scholar whom the family regarded as an embarrassment and who had spent his adult life writing histories rather than pursuing political power. The ancient sources present him as a fool manipulated by his wives and freedmen, but the archaeological and administrative record suggests something more complicated. A man who expanded the empire's bureaucracy, professionalized its civil service, completed the conquest of Britain, and built infrastructure, harbors, aqueducts, roads, on a scale that even his detractors could not ignore. He was also, by the evidence, catastrophically poor at choosing wives. His third wife was Messalina, who became a byword for sexual excess in Roman literature. The sources describe her holding competitions in the palace to determine whether she or a professional prostitute could service more men in a single evening. Whether this happened or whether it is the kind of story Roman historians told about women they wanted to discredit is a question the evidence cannot resolve. What is certain is that Messalina overreached. She participated in what appears to have been a genuine conspiracy to overthrow Claudius and replace him with a younger man, and was executed in the year 48, leaving behind 2 children, a son named Britannicus and a daughter named Octavia. Claudius needed a new wife. The empire needed, or at least the imperial household believed it needed, a stabilizing feminine presence. Several candidates were discussed. The one who won was a woman whose combination of intelligence, lineage, and ruthlessness would, within 6 years, reshape the succession, eliminate a reigning emperor, and place her own son on the throne. Her name was Agrippina. She was Claudius's niece, and she was Nero's mother. Agrippina the Younger was born in the year 15 of the Common Era in a military camp on the Rhine frontier, a fact that would later be used to burnish her credentials as a woman of martial heritage, born among the legions, steeped in the culture of Roman military discipline rather than the decadence of the capital. Her father was Germanicus, the most popular general of his generation, a man whose early death, possibly by poisoning, at the instigation of the Emperor Tiberius, created a martyrdom narrative that his daughter would spend her entire life exploiting. Her mother was Agrippina the Elder, a woman of ferocious will, who openly accused Tiberius of murdering her husband and was eventually arrested, exiled, and starved to death. Whether by her own hand or the emperor's order remains disputed. 2 of Agrippina the Younger's brothers were also killed by the regime. The third brother survived, ascended to the throne, and became Caligula. This is the family. This is the soil from which Nero grew. Agrippina the Younger had learned by the time she reached adulthood a set of lessons that would define every decision she made for the rest of her life. The first was that proximity to power was indistinguishable from proximity to death. Her father had died for being too popular. Her mother had died for being too defiant. Her brothers had died for being too threatening. Power in Rome did not flow through legal channels. It flowed through blood, in both senses of the word. You were born into it and you frequently bled out of it. The second lesson was that a woman's power in the Roman system was entirely derivative. A woman could not hold magistracies, command legions, or address the Senate. She could be the daughter of a great man, the wife of a great man, the mother of a great man. Her influence was real, sometimes decisive, but it was always exercised through men, and it lasted only as long as the man through whom she operated remained alive and compliant. Agrippina absorbed both lessons and drew from them a single strategic conclusion. She needed a son on the throne, and she needed to be the one controlling him. Her first marriage, to Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was arranged when she was barely into her teens. Domitius was wealthy and well-connected. His family, the Ahenobarbi, were an old and powerful line. But he was also, by every account that survives, a thoroughly unpleasant man. He was said to have deliberately run down a child with his chariot on the Appian Way. He was accused of incest with his sister. He cheated his employees and defrauded his associates. Suetonius records that when he was congratulated on the birth of his son and the future Nero, born on the 15th of December in the year 37, Domitius responded that anything produced by himself and Agrippina could only be abominable and a disaster for the state. The line is almost certainly apocryphal. It is the kind of statement that gets retrofitted onto a biography after the ending is known, a narrative convenience that allows the historian to claim that the signs were there from the beginning. But it endures because it captures something real about the family. The Julio-Claudians knew on some level what they were. They could see the pattern, they simply could not stop it. The boy born that December was given the name Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. Not yet Nero, not yet Caesar, not yet anything but the son of a disgraced father and an ambitious mother. One more child in a family where children were instruments of dynastic strategy, loved and discarded according to their utility. Domitius died when the boy was 3. Agrippina was exiled by her brother Caligula shortly after. The specific charges are unclear, but the pattern is familiar. A family member had become inconvenient. She was sent to the Pontian Islands, a cluster of volcanic rocks off the Italian coast, where the empire deposited the people it wanted forgotten. Young Lucius was left in the care of an aunt, his father's sister Domitia Lepida, and passed the early years of his childhood in conditions that, while comfortable by ordinary standards, were a significant step down from the imperial court. We know almost nothing about these years. The sources skip over them. There is no political drama to report, no scandal, no decision of consequence. A small boy grew up in a wealthy household on the outskirts of power, learning to read, learning Greek, learning the names of his ancestors and the stories of their achievements and their murders. He would have known who his mother was. He would have known she was in exile. He would have known why, what this did to him, what it meant to be 3 years old, to lose a father, to have a mother taken away by the state, to be raised by relatives in a household where his very existence was a political liability. We cannot recover. The inner life of a Roman child in the 1st century is not the kind of thing the sources preserve. We have dates and names and anecdotes selected for their dramatic utility. We do not have feelings, we do not have nightmares, we do not have the sound of a boy calling for a mother who does not come, but the boy existed. The feelings existed. And when he grew into a man who could not tolerate being contradicted, who craved applause with a desperation that embarrassed even his supporters, who killed his mother and then spent the rest of his life terrified of her ghost, the connection between the child's experience and the emperor's behavior is not difficult to draw, even if the evidence to draw it with precision is forever lost. Everything changed in January of the year 41. Caligula was assassinated. Claudius, the stammering uncle, was proclaimed emperor, and Agrippina was recalled from exile. She returned to Rome with the focused intensity of a woman who had spent years on a rock in the Tyrrhenian Sea with nothing to do but plan. Her son was 3 years old when she left. He was 6 when she came back. She had lost 3 years of his childhood, 3 years of shaping him, 3 years during which other hands had formed his habits and his loyalties, She would not lose another day, but she could not move immediately. Claudius was married to Messalina, and Messalina had her own son, Britannicus, who was the natural heir to the throne. Agrippina had lineage and intelligence, but Messalina had position. For 7 years, Agrippina waited. She used the time. She cultivated allies in the Senate. She managed her public image with a discipline that would have impressed Augustus himself, appearing modest, pious, dutiful, the grieving daughter of the martyred Germanicus, the devoted mother of an innocent boy who asked nothing from the state but safety. She secured young Lucius's education, arranging for him to be tutored in rhetoric, philosophy, and the arts. She chose his companions carefully. She monitored his friendships, his reading, his habits. She was building an emperor piece by piece in the body of a child. In the year 48, Messalina fell. The details of her downfall are lurid even by Julio Claudian standards. A supposed bigamous marriage to a senator named Gaius Silius, while Claudius was away from Rome, a plot to seize the throne, a hurried execution in the gardens of Lucullus. Whether the conspiracy was real or manufactured remains debated. What matters for our story is the result. Claudius was a widower, and the position of empress was vacant. The campaign Agrippina mounted to fill it was a masterpiece of political engineering. Roman law prohibited marriage between an uncle and a niece. The relationship was considered incestuous. Agrippina arranged for a senator named Lucius Vitellius to propose a change in the law, arguing that such marriages were common in other cultures and that the union would serve the state by consolidating the imperial family. The Senate, which had by this point been thoroughly trained in the art of doing what it was told, voted to permit the match. Claudius and Agrippina were married in the year 49. She was 34 years old. She had survived exile, the murder of most of her family, and 7 years of patient maneuvering. She was now the wife of the Emperor of Rome. She moved fast. Within a year, she had arranged for the philosopher Seneca to be recalled from his own exile and appointed as tutor to her son. Seneca was not chosen for his philosophy, or not only for his philosophy, he was chosen because he was brilliant, politically connected, deeply indebted to Agrippina for his recall, and capable of training a teenage boy to speak, think, and perform like a Roman leader. He was also chosen because he was controllable, or so Agrippina believed. A man who owed you his freedom was a man who would do as he was told. In the year 50, Agrippina achieved the critical stroke. Claudius formally adopted her son. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus became Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. The name change was not cosmetic. It was constitutional. Nero was now legally the emperor's son. And because he was 3 years older than Britannicus, Claudius's natural-born heir, he was first in line for the succession. The logic was ruthless. Britannicus was 11. Nero was 13. In Roman political culture, the toga virilis, the coming-of-age ceremony that marked a boy's transition to legal adulthood, typically occurred around age 14 to 16. Nero would reach it first. He would be presented to the Senate and the people as a young man of the imperial house, while Britannicus was still technically a child. Precedent would be established. Expectations would harden. By the time Britannicus came of age, Nero's position would be entrenched. And so it went. In the year 51, Nero received the toga virilis at the age of 13, early but not unprecedented. He was presented to the Praetorian Guard, who were given a cash donative in his name. He was appointed to priesthoods, given honorary titles, and allowed to address the Senate. Coins were minted bearing his image alongside Claudius's. The message was unmistakable, legible to anyone in the empire who could read a coin. This is the next emperor. Britannicus watched. We have no record of what he thought or felt. He is one of those figures in Roman history who exists primarily as a thing that happened to someone else. He was Claudius's natural son, born to the purple, raised in the expectation that the empire would one day be his, and he watched as a stranger. His stepsister's son, adopted into his family by a woman his father married after his mother was killed, was elevated above him by every mechanism the state possessed. The sources give us one detail, that Britannicus, on at least one occasion, addressed Nero by his original name Domitius, rather than his adopted name. It was a small act of defiance. It was also a reminder to Nero, to the court, to anyone listening, that this boy's claim to the Caesarian name was manufactured, not born. Nero, the sources suggest, never forgave him for it. Agrippina, meanwhile, accumulated powers that no Roman woman had held before. She was given the title Augusta, the feminine form of the emperor's own honorific. She was granted the right to travel in a ceremonial carriage, a privilege previously reserved for priests and vestal virgins. She received foreign ambassadors. She attended Senate meetings, listening from behind a curtain. She could not be present in the chamber itself, but she could hear, and everyone knew she was there. Coins were struck showing her face alongside Claudius's, the two profiles facing each other as equals. She was, in everything but name, co-ruler of the Roman Empire. And she had one more move to make. On the 13th of October, in the year 54, the Emperor Claudius sat down to dinner. Among the dishes served was a plate of mushrooms, a delicacy he was known to favor. Within hours, he was violently ill. By the following morning, he was dead. He was 63 years old. The ancient sources are nearly unanimous. Agrippina poisoned him. The specific accounts vary. Tacitus says the poison was administered by Claudius's food taster, a eunuch named Helotus, at Agrippina's direction. Suetonius offers multiple versions, including one in which Agrippina herself applied the poison with a feather to Claudius's throat, ostensibly to help him vomit after the initial dose proved too slow. Cassius Dio confirms the mushroom account and adds theatrical details. Modern scholars have debated the question without reaching consensus. Claudius was old, he was a heavy drinker, and sudden death in antiquity could have any number of natural explanations. But the timing was suspiciously perfect. Nero was 16, freshly come of age, already recognized by the Senate and the Guard. Britannicus was 13, still legally a child, still months away from the toga virilis that would have given him a competing claim. If Agrippina did not poison Claudius, she was the luckiest woman in the Roman Empire. The body was still warm when the Praetorian Guard proclaimed Nero emperor. The transition was seamless. So seamless, in fact, that it had clearly been rehearsed. Burrus, the prefect of the Guard, had been appointed to his position by Agrippina. Seneca, Nero's tutor, had spent years preparing the boy for exactly this moment. The Senate ratified the accession within hours. Britannicus was not consulted, not mentioned, not considered. He sat somewhere in the palace, a 14-year-old boy whose father had just died and whose inheritance had just been stolen, and waited to see what would happen to him. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, 16 years old, stood before the Praetorian Guard and promised them a donative of 15,000 sesterces per man. He ascended to the Senate and delivered a speech written by Seneca that promised clemency, respect for senatorial prerogatives, and a return to the Augustan model of governance. He was young. He was nervous. He was, by the accounts of those who saw him, charming. He was also, in every way that mattered, his mother's creation. She had chosen his tutors, selected his advisors, arranged his adoption, eliminated his rivals, and, almost certainly, murdered the emperor who stood between him and the throne. Everything Nero was in that moment, everything he possessed, every title and power and golden wreath he owed to Agrippina. She had spent 20 years building this. A son on the throne. Her hand on his shoulder. The empire at her feet. She could not have known, no one in that room could have known that the son she had made would be the one to unmake her. That within 5 years, the boy she had placed on the throne would send men to her bedroom to cut her down. That the mother who had killed for her son would be killed by him. But that was later. That was the future, still hidden behind the curtain of what had not yet happened. For now, in October of the year 54, a teenager sat on the throne of the world, and the woman who put him there stood at his side, and the empire, the vast, groaning, magnificent, blood-soaked machinery of Roman power, turned its gaze to see what kind of ruler this boy would be. The answer for a while was surprising. The first 5 years of Nero's reign would later be known as the Quinquennium Neronis, a phrase attributed, perhaps apocryphally, to the Emperor Trajan, who reportedly called it the finest period of governance in Roman imperial history. Whether Trajan actually said this is uncertain. What is certain is that the reputation endured and that it was within limits deserved. The boy who took the throne in October of 54 was not governing alone. He was, in the language of modern political science, the front end of a triumvirate, 3 people sharing power behind the facade of a single ruler. Nero held the titles, Seneca shaped the policy, Burrus controlled the guard, and behind all 3, visible in every public appearance, present at every audience, her profile stamped on the coins of the realm facing her sons as though they were co-emperors, stood Agrippina. The arrangement was, for a time, remarkably effective. Seneca was a philosopher, but he was not the kind of philosopher who confused abstraction with governance. He was a Stoic by intellectual commitment and a pragmatist by temperament, a man who had written treatises on the virtues of poverty while amassing one of the largest private fortunes in the empire, and who saw no contradiction in this because he understood that power required resources and that resources required compromise. His political philosophy, stripped of its rhetorical dress, was simple. Govern mildly, respect the Senate's dignity even while ignoring its authority, keep the army paid, keep the people fed, and above all, keep the emperor out of trouble. Burrus complemented him precisely. Where Seneca was subtle, Burrus was blunt. Where Seneca managed the Senate, Burrus managed the soldiers. He was a career military man, a provincial from Gaul, who had risen through the officer corps on competence rather than connections. And he brought to the Praetorian prefecture a professional discipline that the position had often lacked. Together, Seneca and Burrus formed a governing partnership that functioned in practice as a regency. 2 experienced adults managing the empire while its teenage ruler learned his role. And for those first years, the policies they produced were genuinely good. Taxes were reduced in the provinces. The Senate was consulted on legislation and treated with a deference it had not enjoyed since the early years of Augustus. The courts were reformed. Nero himself, or Seneca writing through Nero, issued edicts requiring that legal proceedings be conducted openly, that defendants be allowed to present their cases in full, that judges explain their reasoning. Freed slaves were given enhanced legal protections. The practice of forcing gladiators to fight to the death was curtailed, at least temporarily. Provincial governors who were caught extorting their subjects were prosecuted rather than protected. These were not radical reforms. They did not alter the fundamental structure of Roman autocracy, but they represented a style of governance, consultative, restrained, attentive to the appearance of justice, that the senatorial class had been craving since the paranoid later years of Tiberius and the chaotic reigns of Caligula and Claudius. For the men who wrote the histories, who sat in the Senate, who owned the estates and managed the legal infrastructure of the empire, the early years of Nero felt like a restoration. The system was working as it was supposed to work. The question that the sources do not adequately address, because it was not a question that interested them, is what Nero himself wanted. He was 16. He was, by every indication, intelligent. His education under Seneca had been rigorous and broad. Rhetoric, literature, philosophy, music, mathematics, the full curriculum of a Roman aristocrat's intellectual formation. He spoke Greek fluently, composed poetry in both languages, played the lyre with what appears to have been genuine skill rather than merely imperial indulgence, and displayed a sensitivity to aesthetic experience that his tutors found promising and his generals found troubling. Because the thing Nero wanted, the thing he had wanted since childhood, the thing that would define and ultimately destroy his reign, was not power. It was applause. He wanted to perform. He wanted to sing. He wanted to stand on a stage and recite his own compositions before an audience that loved him not because he was emperor, but because he was gifted. This desire was, in the context of first-century Roman aristocratic culture, not merely unusual, it was scandalous. Roman senators did not perform. Roman emperors emphatically did not perform. The stage was the province of slaves, freedmen, and social outcasts. People whose bodies were, in the Roman legal imagination, instruments for the entertainment of their betters. For a man of senatorial rank to appear on stage was a degradation so severe that it carried legal penalties. For an emperor to do so was an inversion of the social order so complete that it threatened the conceptual foundations of Roman hierarchy. Nero did not care, or rather, he cared. He felt the weight of the prohibition, he understood what he was violating, but the desire was stronger than the taboo. In the early years, Seneca and Burrus managed it. They channeled his artistic impulses into private performances, recitations before invited audiences, musical evenings in the palace, chariot racing in enclosed grounds where the public could not see. They treated his aestheticism the way a responsible handler treats a volatile chemical. Keep it contained, keep it controlled, give it just enough oxygen to burn without exploding. This worked for a while. It worked as long as Nero was willing to accept the distinction between the private man and the public emperor, between the artist he wanted to be and the ruler he was required to be. It would not work forever. But the first crisis of the reign was not about art, it was about Agrippina. The collision between Nero and his mother began almost immediately, and it followed a pattern so ancient that it hardly needs explanation. A parent who has sacrificed everything to create a child's success discovers that the child, having succeeded, no longer wishes to be controlled. Agrippina had not placed Nero on the throne out of maternal love, or not only out of maternal love, she had placed him there to rule through him, the entire architecture of her adult life. The marriage to Claudius, the adoption, the probable murder, the careful cultivation of Seneca and Burrus, was designed to produce a specific outcome: an emperor who owed everything to his mother and who would govern as her instrument. She expected to be consulted on every decision. She expected her preferences to shape policy. She expected, in short, to be the power behind the throne in a system where the throne was the only power that mattered. For the first weeks and months, she got what she expected. Nero deferred to her visibly, publicly, almost ostentatiously. The password he gave to the Praetorian Guard on his first night as emperor was Optima Mater, the best of mothers. He walked behind her in processions. He allowed her to sit beside him during audiences. The coins of the early reign tell the story in miniature. On the first issues, Agrippina's profile faces Nero's in equal size, the two heads confronting each other like paired rulers. On later issues, her profile is moved to the reverse side. On still later ones, it disappears entirely. The physical evidence of the coins tracks the political reality almost exactly. Within months of Nero's accession, the balance of power began to shift, not because Nero seized it, but because Seneca and Burrus carefully, deliberately, methodically redirected it. They understood something that Agrippina did not: that a teenage boy's dependence on his mother is a temporary condition, and that the transition from dependence to autonomy in a person who holds absolute power would be sudden and total. Seneca and Burrus had their own reasons for wanting Agrippina diminished. As long as she controlled Nero, they were her subordinates, not his advisors. Their influence depended on Nero's willingness to listen to them rather than to her, and that willingness increased in direct proportion to his resentment of her authority. They did not need to poison the relationship. They merely needed to let it follow its natural course, offering Nero, at each stage, the alternative of their counsel instead of her commands. The first open breach came over a woman. Nero had taken a mistress, a freedwoman named Claudia Acte, described in the sources as beautiful, devoted, and critically unthreatening. She was not of noble birth. She had no political connections. She could not compete with Agrippina for influence because she had no influence to wield. She was, in the language of modern psychology, a safe attachment. Someone who offered Nero affection without conditions, warmth without demands, a relationship in which he was loved for himself rather than for what he could provide. Agrippina was furious. Her fury was partly social. The emperor's liaison with a freed woman was beneath the dignity of the house, but it was mainly strategic. A woman who held Nero's affection was a woman who could redirect his loyalties. If Nero learned that he could find emotional sustenance outside the structure Agrippina had built, the entire architecture of her control was at risk. She confronted him. The sources describe shouting matches, threats, emotional manipulation on a scale that suggests either genuine desperation or the kind of domestic volatility that Roman historians love to attribute to powerful women. Tacitus reports that Agrippina threatened to take Britannicus, Claudius's natural son, still alive, still a potential rival, and present him to the Praetorian Guard as the legitimate emperor, undoing everything she had built to put Nero in power. Whether she meant it as a genuine threat or merely as leverage is impossible to determine. What is clear is that Nero heard it as both. Britannicus was 14 years old. He was approaching the age at which he could legally claim adult status, and with it a competing claim to the succession. He was Claudius's son by blood. Nero was Claudius's son by adoption. In a contest of legitimacy, Britannicus held the stronger card in the rumor. And Agrippina, by threatening to play it, had reminded everyone in the palace that the card existed. The boy died in February of the year 55. Roughly 4 months after Nero took the throne. The account, as preserved in Tacitus, has the precision of a set piece. Britannicus was dining with Nero and other members of the imperial household. A servant brought him a drink that was too hot. He sent it back. Cold water was added. He drank. He collapsed. Convulsions. Silence. Nero, reclining at the table, reportedly remarked without visible concern that Britannicus suffered from epilepsy and that such fits were common. The other diners looked at each other and said nothing. The body was removed. The funeral was held that night, in the rain, in haste, with minimal ceremony. He was buried before dawn. The poison, if it was poison, was almost certainly obtained from a woman named Locusta, a professional poisoner whom the sources describe with remarkable casualness, as though the empire maintained toxicologists the way it maintained engineers. Locusta had reportedly supplied the poison that killed Claudius as well, and she would remain in what can only be described as imperial employment for the duration of Nero's reign. She was in her way a civil servant, one whose particular expertise the state found indispensable. Whether Nero personally ordered Britannicus's death or whether the decision was made by his advisors on his behalf is disputed. Tacitus implies Nero's direct involvement. Suetonius states it plainly. The strategic logic, regardless of who gave the order, is clear. Britannicus was a threat not because he was powerful, but because he could be made powerful by anyone who wanted to challenge Nero, including and especially Agrippina. Removing him removed the weapon from her hand. Agrippina understood this. She understood that the death of Britannicus was not merely a political murder, but a message directed specifically at her. The instrument you threatened to use against me has been destroyed, and you are now alone. Her response, according to Tacitus, was fear. For the first time in her life, the woman who had navigated the most dangerous court in the ancient world, who had survived exile, the reign of Caligula, the treachery of Messalina, and the accumulated violence of 3 decades of Julio-Claudian politics, was afraid. Not of the system, of her son. She began cultivating Octavia, Claudius's daughter, Nero's wife, a young woman who had been married to Nero as part of Agrippina's dynastic strategy and who now represented the only remaining link to the Claudian bloodline. She gathered sympathizers. She hoarded money. She was, the sources suggest, preparing a fallback position, though for what exactly is unclear. She could not seize the throne herself. She could not install an alternative. She could only make herself indispensable or make herself dangerous, and she had already failed at the former. Nero responded by stripping her of her remaining privileges. Her military guard was removed. She was moved out of the imperial palace and into a private residence. Her visitors were monitored. Her correspondence was almost certainly read. The woman who had stood beside her son on the coins of the realm, whose profile had faced his as an equal, was being systematically reduced to a private citizen. And in a system where private citizens who had once held power tended to die suddenly, the trajectory was obvious. But Nero did not kill her. Not yet. For 4 years, from the death of Britannicus in 55 to the spring of 59, mother and son existed in a state of armed suspension, each watching the other, each aware of what the other was capable of, neither willing to force the final confrontation. During those 4 years, Nero governed, and the governance, by the standards of Roman imperial administration, remained good. The Senate functioned. The provinces were managed. The legal reforms continued. Seneca and Burrus maintained their positions, guiding policy with a competence that suggests the real work of empire was being done by professionals regardless of what was happening inside the palace walls. But inside the palace walls, something was changing. Nero had found another woman. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and she was everything Claudia Acti was not. Highborn, ambitious, politically connected, and willing to use her influence over Nero to advance her own position. The sources describe her as stunningly beautiful. Tacitus gives her a rare physical description, noting her auburn hair and luminous complexion. But beauty in Roman historical writing is almost always code for danger. And Poppaea was dangerous in a specific way. She wanted to be empress. She wanted the title, the position, the legal standing that Acti could never claim. And the obstacle between her and the imperial marriage was not merely Nero's existing wife, Octavia, but the woman who had arranged that marriage in the first place, Agrippina. Poppaea, according to Tacitus, goaded Nero. She mocked him for being under his mother's control. She questioned his independence, his authority, his manhood. She told him, or the sources say she told him, which is not the same thing, that he was not truly emperor as long as Agrippina lived, that the court still looked to his mother for signals, that his own freedmen took their instructions from her rather than from him. How much of this is real, and how much is the standard Roman narrative of the manipulative seductress leading a weak man to destruction, is impossible to determine. Tacitus was a brilliant writer, but he was also a man of his time, and the trope of the beautiful woman whispering poison into the ruler's ear was ancient when he deployed it. What we can say is that the combination of Poppaea's ambition and Nero's resentment produced, by the spring of the year 59, a decision. The decision was matricide. The murder of Agrippina is the hinge on which Nero's story turns. Everything before it can be explained, contextualized, partially excused by the brutal norms of Roman dynastic politics. Britannicus was a rival. His death was a political calculation of the kind that every emperor before Nero had made. But the murder of one's own mother, the woman who bore you, raised you, schemed for you, killed for you, occupied a category so extreme that even Rome, which had seen everything, recoiled. And the manner of it was worse than the fact. Because Nero did not simply order Agrippina killed, he tried to make it look like an accident. And the attempt was so elaborate, so theatrical, so grotesquely incompetent, that it reads less like statecraft than like a scene from a play written by a man who had confused drama with reality. The plan, as Tacitus describes it, was devised by Anicetus, the commander of the fleet at Misenum, a freedman who owed his position to Nero and who, the sources note, had hated Agrippina for years. The scheme was this: a ship would be built with a collapsible cabin and a weighted ceiling, designed to crush or drown its passenger during a nighttime voyage across the Bay of Naples. Nero would invite his mother to dinner at his villa in Baiae. the resort town where the Roman elite gathered to drink, bathe, and conduct the kind of business that benefited from distance from the capital. And after the meal, he would offer her the use of this specially constructed vessel to return home. It was on its face absurd, a collapsing boat, an engineered accident, a murder weapon that required naval architecture, stage machinery, and the cooperation of an entire ship's crew. It belonged in a theater, not in the real world. And this perhaps is the point, or at least a point worth holding in mind. Nero thought in theatrical terms. He conceived of his life as a performance, and when he decided to kill his mother, he designed the killing as he would have designed a scene, with spectacle, with mechanism, with a dramatic arc that moved from invitation to dinner to catastrophe at sea. The dinner took place. The sources describe Nero as unusually affectionate, embracing his mother, kissing her, prolonging the meal with warmth that may have been genuine guilt or may have been the performance of a man who knew what was coming and wanted to play his part well. Agrippina, whether suspicious or merely cautious, had arrived in her own vessel. She was persuaded, the sources do not say by whom, to accept the offer of the ornamental ship for the return journey. The boat sailed. The mechanism activated. The ceiling collapsed. It did not work. Agrippina's attendant, a woman named Acerronia, was crushed and killed. Agrippina herself was injured but alive. She had been partially protected by the frame of her couch. The ship began to sink, but slowly, unevenly, as though the engineering had been as incompetent as the morality. Agrippina understood immediately what had happened. According to Tacitus, she said nothing about the assassination attempt. She simply slipped into the water and swam. She swam in the dark, in the Bay of Naples, with an injured shoulder, away from the wreckage of a ship designed to kill her, and she reached the shore alive. She sent word to Nero that she had survived a terrible accident. The message was carefully phrased. She did not accuse him, did not confront him, did not reveal that she knew. She was, even now, playing the game. By pretending to believe it was an accident, she was offering Nero a way out, a chance to abandon the plot, to pretend it had never happened, to return to the armed truce of the previous years. Nero panicked. He summoned Seneca and Burrus. The scene Tacitus describes is extraordinary. The emperor of Rome, 21 years old, terrified, asking his philosopher and his general what to do about the fact that his mother had survived his attempt to murder her. Seneca and Burrus looked at each other. Seneca turned to Burrus and asked if the Praetorian Guard could be ordered to kill her. Burrus refused. The guard was loyal to the house of Germanicus, he said. Agrippina was Germanicus's daughter, and the soldiers would not raise a hand against her. Anicetus volunteered. He would finish what the boat had failed to do. The detail that follows is the one that Tacitus renders with the cold precision for which he is justly celebrated. Anicetus and a squad of sailors went to Agrippina's villa. They broke in, they surrounded her bed. A centurion drew his sword. Agrippina, seeing the blade, exposed her abdomen, the womb that had carried Nero's, and said, according to Tacitus, "Ventrum feri, strike here, strike the belly, strike." She was stabbed multiple times. She died in her bedroom, in the villa to which her son had exiled her, killed by freedmen and sailors acting on the orders of the boy she had spent her life creating. Nero came to see the body. The sources disagree on what happened next. Tacitus, with characteristic restraint, says only that Nero viewed the corpse and commented on her physical appearance, a detail so chilling in its banality that it hardly requires commentary. Suetonius, with characteristic excess, claims that Nero examined the body, handled her limbs, praised some features and criticized others, and then called for wine. Cassius Dio adds further details that grow more theatrical with each retelling. What is beyond dispute is this: Nero had his mother cremated that same night. The funeral was minimal. No tomb was constructed. The ashes were interred without ceremony, without monument, without inscription. The woman who had been Augusta, who had stood beside emperors who had shaped the succession of the most powerful state on earth, was erased from the physical landscape as thoroughly as a person could be erased. And Nero wrote a letter to the Senate. The letter, drafted by Seneca, because of course it was drafted by Seneca, who else could have produced prose adequate to the occasion, explained that Agrippina had been discovered plotting against the emperor's life, that she had attempted to suborn the Praetorian Guard, that she had conspired with enemies of the state, that she had, upon being discovered, taken her own life. The Senate accepted the letter, voted thanks to the gods for the emperor's deliverance, and instituted annual festivals to celebrate his survival. The Senate knew, everyone knew, the fiction was transparent, and the transparency was the point. The letter was not meant to convince, it was meant to establish the official version, to create a narrative that could be cited and repeated and recorded, a version of events that protected not Nero from the truth but the Senate from the obligation to act on it. If Agrippina had been murdered, the Senate would be compelled to respond. If she had been a traitor who killed herself, the Senate could exhale and move on. This was the machinery of autocracy in action, not the violence itself. Every system produces violence, but the collaborative fiction that surrounded the violence, the tacit agreement between ruler and ruled that certain things would be said and certain things would not be said, and that everyone would pretend to believe the things that were said while privately knowing the things that were not. Nero returned to Rome. He was 21 years old. He had murdered his mother. He had gotten away with it. And something in him, something that Seneca had managed, that Burrus had contained, that the structures of good governance had held in check, began to break open. The ancient sources are remarkably consistent in identifying the death of Agrippina as the turning point of Nero's reign, the moment at which the promising young emperor began his transformation into the figure that history would remember. And while the sources had their own reasons for locating the break precisely here, their instinct was not wrong. Something did change after the year 59. Though whether the change was in Nero himself or in the constraints that surrounded him is a question worth pausing over. As long as Agrippina lived, Nero had been afraid. Not of her physical power, she had none, not after her guard was stripped and her allies scattered, but of her knowledge, her legitimacy, her capacity to remind him and the world that he was a manufactured emperor, a product of her ambition rather than his own merit. She was the living evidence of everything artificial in his position. Killing her removed the evidence. It also removed the fear, and with the fear went the restraint. Seneca saw it. Burrus saw it. The shift was not immediate. It was not as though Nero woke the morning after his mother's death and declared himself a tyrant. It was gradual, incremental, a slow loosening of the self-discipline that his advisors had spent years cultivating. He began spending more time on his artistic pursuits and less on the business of governance. He began performing in semi-public settings, not yet on the public stage, but before audiences large enough that the distinction was becoming meaningless. He began surrounding himself with companions who encouraged his worst impulses rather than checking them. Young men of aristocratic birth who found it entertaining or profitable to tell the emperor that his voice was divine, his poetry sublime, his chariot driving the finest in Rome. The court, which had functioned under Seneca and Burrus as something resembling a government, began to function instead as an audience. The emperor did not want advisors, he wanted admirers. And the difference between the two in a system with no institutional checks on imperial behavior was the difference between governance and catastrophe. Burrus died in the year 62. The cause was reported as a throat tumor, though poisoning was inevitably suspected. Seneca, deprived of his partner and increasingly unable to influence the emperor he had shaped, requested permission to retire. The request was, in the Roman context, an act of remarkable political courage or remarkable political desperation. A man who asked to leave the emperor's service was implicitly declaring that the emperor's service was no longer worth serving in. Nero refused the request, but the relationship between them was effectively over. Seneca retreated to his estates. He would not return to power. He would, 3 years later, be ordered to open his veins. Their replacements told the story of the new dispensation, Ophonius Tigellinus became the new prefect of the Praetorian Guard, a man whose reputation in the sources is uniformly terrible. A former exile and horse breeder who had clawed his way back to Rome through flattery and who understood that his survival depended entirely on giving Nero what Nero wanted. Where Burrus had been a soldier who managed an emperor, Tigellinus was a courtier who served one. The distinction was existential. The year 62 also brought the resolution of Nero's marital situation, and it was resolved with a brutality that even the already numbed court found shocking. Octavia, Claudius's daughter, Nero's wife since adolescence, a woman who had committed no offense beyond failing to be Poppaea, was divorced, exiled, and then, when exile proved insufficiently final, executed. She was 22 years old. Her head was brought to Poppaea as proof that the obstacle had been removed. Nero married Poppaea 12 days after the divorce. The Roman people, who had remained largely supportive of Nero through the death of Britannicus and even through the murder of Agrippina, protested. Octavia had been popular. She was Claudius's daughter. She was young, she was visibly innocent, and her suffering had a clarity that the court's other victims lacked. Demonstrations appeared in the streets. Statues of Poppaea were toppled. Garlands were placed on Octavia's images. The protests were suppressed quickly and with sufficient force to discourage repetition, but they marked something new. The first visible fracture between Nero and the populace whose love he craved above all things. He did not learn from it. He could not learn from it. The capacity for self-correction requires the capacity to hear criticism. And Nero had spent the last 8 years in an environment designed to ensure that no criticism reached him. Seneca had managed him with flattery disguised as philosophy. Burrus had managed him with deference disguised as loyalty. Agrippina had managed him with guilt disguised as love. And now all three were gone, dead, retired, murdered. And the men who replaced them managed him with the only tool they had left. They told him he was right. About everything. Always. And so Nero entered the second half of his reign, the half that history remembers. With the last of his restraints removed, the last of his moderating influences silenced, and the full terrifying apparatus of Roman imperial power at the disposal of a man who believed with increasing conviction that he was not merely an emperor who happened to be an artist, but an artist who happened to be an emperor. That the singing was not the indulgence. The governing was the indulgence. That the true Nero, the real Nero, the Nero who mattered, was the one who stood on stage and opened his mouth and let the music pour out into a world that was finally, at last, ready to listen. Rome was not ready. Rome would never be ready. But Nero could not see that because by now there was no one left in the room willing to tell him. The stage was set, and in the summer of the year 64, the fire came. On the night of July 18th in the year 64, a fire broke out in the shops clustered along the eastern end of the Circus Maximus. In the valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills, the area was dense with commerce. Oil merchants, grain sellers, dealers in cloth and spice whose wooden stalls pressed against each other in the narrow streets like kindling stacked in a hearth. The summer had been dry. The wind was blowing from the south. The flames found the oil found the timber found the tenements. Within hours the fire had jumped the circus and was climbing the Palatine Hill. Rome in the year 64 was a city of roughly 1 million people, the largest concentration of human beings in the Western world, crammed into an area that had never been planned and could not be controlled. The streets were narrow, crooked, built by accretion over centuries rather than by design. The apartment blocks, insulae, the Romans called them, islands, rose 5, 6, 7 stories on foundations meant for 2. They were built of wood and rubble concrete. Their upper floors jutting over the streets on timber cantilevers that nearly touched the buildings opposite, creating corridors so tight that a man could lean from his window and shake hands with his neighbor across the way. The ground floors housed bakeries with open ovens, fulleries with chemical vats, metal workers with forges. Every block was a fire waiting to happen. The entire city was a fire waiting to happen. It had happened before. Rome burned with a regularity that its residents accepted the way coastal cities accept hurricanes as a periodic catastrophe built into the conditions of their existence. But this fire was different. It burned for 6 days. It was brought under partial control, then reignited, then burned for 3 more days. When it finally exhausted itself, when there was nothing left in its path to consume, 10 of Rome's 14 administrative districts had been damaged. 3 were destroyed entirely, reduced to ash and blackened foundation stones. The Palatine Hill, where the imperial residence stood, was gutted. The temple of Jupiter Stator, which tradition dated to the founding of the city, was gone. The temple of Vesta, where the sacred flame of Rome had burned for 7 centuries, was gone. The wooden galleries, the tenement blocks, the workshops, the warehouses, the libraries, the archives, gone. Hundreds of thousands of people were homeless. The death toll is unrecorded, which in Roman historiography usually means it was too large or too politically inconvenient to count. It was the worst disaster in the city's history, and the question that has echoed through every century since, the question that has attached itself to Nero's name like a brand, is whether he started it. The image is indelible. Nero on the balcony, lyre in hand, singing of the fall of Troy while Rome burns below him. It is one of the most famous scenes in Western historical memory. It appears in paintings, novels, films, operas. It is the single image most people carry in their minds when they hear Nero's name. And it is, in all probability, false. The sources themselves cannot agree. Tacitus, the most careful and the most hostile, states explicitly that Nero was not in Rome when the fire began. He was at Antium, his birthplace, 35 miles down the coast. Tacitus reports that Nero returned to the city when news of the fire reached him and personally directed the relief effort, opening public buildings and his own gardens to shelter the displaced, arranging emergency food supplies, reducing the price of grain. Only then does Tacitus add, almost as an aside, that a rumor circulated that Nero had watched the fire from a private stage and sung a composition about the destruction of Troy. Tacitus does not endorse the rumor. He reports it as a rumor. Suetonius is less restrained. He places Nero on the Tower of Maecenas, watching the fire with delight, dressed in theatrical costume, performing the sack of Ilium on his private stage. But Suetonius, as we have already noted, collects anecdotes without evaluating them. He presents the scene as fact and moves on. Cassius Dio, writing a century and a half later, elaborates further. In his account, Nero not only watched and sang, but ordered the fire set, dispatching men with torches into the city while he performed from a rooftop. By the time Dio writes, the story has achieved its final, fully theatrical form. The emperor as arsonist, the artist as destroyer, the performance and the catastrophe fused into a single image of decadent monstrosity. The progression is instructive. With each retelling, the story grows more vivid, more damning, and less plausible. The earliest account hedges. The middle account asserts. The latest account embellishes. This is the trajectory of a legend, not a fact. What can we say with reasonable confidence? The fire started in an area of dense commercial activity, in high summer during dry conditions with strong winds. Accidental fires of this kind were common in Rome. There had been major conflagrations in 27 before the Common Era, in the year 6 in the year 36. The physical conditions for a catastrophic fire existed independently of anyone's intention. An overturned lamp, a neglected forge, a spark from a bakery oven carried by wind into a shop full of linen. Any of these could have been the cause, and none of them would have required an emperor's torch. Against this, there is the fact that the fire reignited after being partially controlled in a district associated with Tigellinus, Nero's prefect, which suggested to some contemporaries that the second outbreak was deliberate. There is the fact that Nero subsequently built his vast new palace, the Domus Aurea, on land cleared by the fire, And there is the simple psychological plausibility. Nero was a man who wanted to rebuild Rome, who found the old city aesthetically offensive, who had spoken openly about his desire to create a new urban plan worthy of the empire's capital. But wanting to rebuild Rome and burning it down to do so are separated by a chasm that the evidence does not bridge. Nero's subsequent building program was ambitious, but it was also a rational response to a disaster that had already occurred. Every Roman emperor before him had used catastrophe as an opportunity for construction, just as every city in every era has rebuilt after fire, flood, or earthquake in forms that reflect the current ruler's ambitions. The argument from consequence, he benefited, therefore he must have caused it, is a fallacy so basic that it would be dismissed in any other context. It survives here because the story is too good to surrender, because the image of the fiddling emperor satisfies something in the human appetite for narrative that mere probability cannot dislodge. The fiddle, incidentally, did not exist. The instrument Nero played was the cithara, a large stringed instrument of the lyre family. And the English word fiddling, with its connotation of trivial, useless activity, entered the idiom centuries later, carrying associations that the original story did not possess. The phrase, Nero fiddled while Rome burned, is a mistranslation of a rumor about an instrument that was not a fiddle, during a fire that may have been an accident performed by a man who may not have been present. It is, in miniature, a perfect example of how historical memory works, not by preserving facts but by constructing images, and then defending those images against the facts that threaten them. What is not in dispute is what happened next. The city was in ruins. Hundreds of thousands of Romans were homeless, hungry, frightened, and looking for an explanation. Nero had provided material relief. The food distribution and the shelter were real, and the ancient sources, even the hostile ones, acknowledged them. But material relief was not sufficient. The people wanted to know why this had happened and who was responsible. The rumor that Nero himself had ordered the fire was spreading, and no amount of grain distribution could suppress it. Nero needed a scapegoat. He found one. The Christians. We must pause here, because the passage we are about to enter is one of the most consequential in Western history, and it requires a precision that the subject does not always receive. In the year 64, Christianity was not what it would become. It was not a state religion, not an organized church, not a theological system with councils and creeds and cathedrals. It was a small, marginal Jewish sect, one of many such sects proliferating in the Eastern Mediterranean during this period, whose adherents believed that a Galilean preacher executed by the Roman governor of Judea roughly 30 years earlier had risen from the dead and would soon return to establish the kingdom of God on earth. Its membership was concentrated in the eastern provinces, particularly in Syria, Asia Minor, and Judea itself, but it had established communities in Rome, drawn primarily from the city's large population of Jewish immigrants and their Gentile associates. To the Roman establishment, the Christians were barely visible. They were not a political movement. They were not a military threat. They were a religious oddity. One more Eastern cult in a city already crowded with Eastern cults, distinguished from the others primarily by their exclusivity. Where the devotees of Isis or Mithras or Cybele were happy to add their god to the existing pantheon, the Christians insisted that their god was the only god, that the traditional Roman gods were false, and that the empire's religious ceremonies, which were simultaneously civic ceremonies, expressions of loyalty to the state, were not merely unnecessary but sinful. This made them unpopular with their neighbors. It also made them conspicuous. Tacitus describes what Nero did in a passage that remains one of the most discussed in ancient literature. He writes that Nero arrested those who admitted to being Christians and then, on their testimony, arrested a vast multitude more, not, Tacitus specifies, on the charge of arson, but on the charge of hatred of the human race, odium humani generis. The punishment was spectacular. Some were covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified. Others were coated in pitch and set alight in Nero's gardens, used as human torches to illuminate the nighttime festivities. Tacitus, who has no sympathy for the Christians, he calls their beliefs a destructive superstition and their practices depraved. Nevertheless, records that the brutality of the punishment produced a reaction of pity among the Roman people. They did not believe the Christians were innocent. They believed the punishment exceeded the crime. The cruelty was so excessive, so theatrical, so clearly designed to serve the emperor's need for spectacle rather than the state's need for justice, that it undermined its own purpose. Instead of deflecting blame from Nero, it confirmed the suspicion that the fire and its aftermath were both expressions of a single imperial pathology, a ruler who had lost the ability to distinguish between governance and performance, between justice and entertainment, between a decision and a scene. The persecution was, as far as we can determine, localized and temporary. There is no evidence that Nero issued a general edict against Christians across the empire. The violence was confined to Rome and to the specific context of the fire's aftermath, but its consequences were incalculable. The persecution of 64 became the foundational trauma of the early Christian community, the first organized assault by the Roman state on the followers of Christ. Later tradition held that both Peter and Paul were martyred in Rome during this period, though the evidence for the specific circumstances of their deaths is thin and contested. What is certain is that the memory of Nero's cruelty was preserved, amplified, and theologized by the Christian community in the centuries that followed, until Nero became not merely a bad emperor but a figure of apocalyptic evil. The Antichrist, the beast whose number was encoded in the book of Revelation, the embodiment of worldly power turned against God's people. The number 666, which appears in Revelation 13:18 as the number of the beast, can be derived through Hebrew numerological calculation known as gematria, from the phrase Neron Caesar, transliterated into Hebrew characters. Whether the author of Revelation intended this specific identification is debated. That later Christian readers understood it this way is not. And so the persecution that Nero ordered to deflect blame for a fire he probably did not set became, over centuries, the foundation for a theological demonization that made his name synonymous with satanic opposition to the divine order. The historical Nero, a complicated, incompetent, occasionally gifted, frequently cruel Roman politician, was replaced by the mythological Nero, a figure of pure evil whose crimes were not political, but cosmic. The man disappeared into the symbol. The symbol proved more durable than the man. This is what the fire did, not the physical destruction. Rome was rebuilt, more splendidly than before within a decade. The fire's true consequence was narrative. It gave Nero's enemies, both the senatorial class who hated him for political reasons and the Christian community who hated him for theological ones, a story so powerful that it consumed the man at its center. The fiddling emperor, the persecutor of saints, the Antichrist. These were stories told by people who needed Nero to be a monster, and they told them so well that the monster is all we have left. Somewhere behind the monster, a man continued to govern. We should try to see him. In the aftermath of the fire, Nero rebuilt Rome. And whatever else can be said about his reign, whatever moral judgments the evidence compels, for the rebuilding was extraordinary. The new Rome was designed to prevent a recurrence of the catastrophe that had destroyed the old one. Building regulations were issued with a specificity that suggests genuine administrative competence, whether Nero's own or his staff's. Streets were widened. Building heights were restricted. The use of timber in load-bearing walls was curtailed in favor of fire-resistant stone from the Alban Hills and Gabii. Open courtyards were mandated between buildings to serve as fire breaks. Porticos were added to the fronts of apartment blocks and covered walkways that served both as shelter and as platforms from which firefighters could access upper stories. Water distribution was improved, with new aqueduct branches bringing supply to neighborhoods that had previously relied on wells and cisterns. The new city was, by any objective standard, better than the one it replaced. It was safer, better organized, better supplied with water, and more rationally planned. It was also, in the eyes of some of its residents, worse. It's because it was unfamiliar. because the narrow, crooked streets of the old city had possessed a character that the wide, straight avenues of the new one lacked, and because Romans, like all people, were suspicious of improvement when it came at the cost of the landscape they knew. Tacitus himself, despite acknowledging the practical merits of the new plan, adds sourly that the old Rome, with its shade-giving narrow streets, had been healthier in summer. The new wide avenues admitted too much sun. But the rebuilding that captured the imagination of the ancient world, and that has captured it ever since, was not the public infrastructure. It was the palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. Nero's new residence occupied, depending on which estimate you accept, between 100 and 300 acres in the center of Rome, an area cleared partly by the fire and partly by deliberate demolition afterward. It was not, in the conventional sense, a house. It was a landscape, a private country estate transplanted into the heart of the city, complete with vineyards, pastures, forests, an artificial lake, and a mile-long colonnade. The entrance hall was large enough to contain a colossal statue of Nero, 120 feet tall, gilded in bronze. The dining rooms had ceilings of ivory that opened to shower guests with flowers and perfume. One circular banqueting hall rotated continuously on hidden machinery, turning in synchronization with the movement of the heavens. The walls were encrusted with gold leaf, precious stones, and mother of pearl. The baths were fed with both seawater and sulfur water piped in from distant sources. When Nero first entered the completed palace, he reportedly remarked, "At last I can begin to live like a human being." The line preserved in Suetonius is usually cited as evidence of Nero's grotesque megalomania, and it is that he, a man who considers 300 acres of gold-plated luxury to be the baseline of human habitation, has lost contact with the species he claims membership in. But the line also reveals something else, something more unsettling. Nero did not say he was living like an emperor. He said he was living like a human being. The implication is that everything before the Palatine residence, the traditional trappings of imperial power, the role of princeps as Augustus had designed it, had been a kind of imprisonment, a costume he was forced to wear, a performance he was forced to give. The Golden House was, in his mind, not an indulgence but a liberation, not excess but authenticity. The first time in his life he had been allowed to be himself. This is the tragedy of Nero, or one version of it. The man who had the most power in the known world experienced that power as confinement. The role he had been given, the role his mother had killed to give him, was a cage, and the only way he could express his true nature was to break the cage open. And the cage was the empire, and breaking it open meant breaking everything inside it. The Senate saw the Golden House and understood it as an insult. The palace consumed public land. Neighborhoods, temples, gardens that had belonged to the Roman people were swallowed into one man's private park. The message was architectural. The city exists to serve the emperor, not the other way around. The popular joke that circulated. Rome is becoming a single house. Citizens migrate to Veii unless the house swallows Veii too, captured the resentment with a precision that political analysis could not match. And the cost. The Golden House was ruinously expensive, and the fire had already devastated the treasury. Nero financed the rebuilding through a combination of measures that alienated virtually every constituency in the empire. Taxes were increased, contributions were extracted from the provinces, not requested, extracted with a coercive force that provincial governors recognized as extortion wearing a civic mask. Temple treasuries were raided. The gold and silver offerings of centuries, dedications to the gods by generals, statesmen, private citizens, were melted down and minted into coin. Most consequentially, Nero debased the currency. He reduced the silver content of the denarius by approximately 10%, and the weight of the gold aureus by a similar proportion. This was, in one sense, a rational monetary policy. The empire's economy had been growing faster than its precious metal supply, and a modest debasement could ease the liquidity constraints that were beginning to produce deflationary pressure in the provinces. Modern economists have noted that Nero's debasement was, in purely technical terms, one of the more defensible monetary interventions of the early empire. But the political effect was devastating. Roman currency was a statement of imperial credibility. The purity of the coinage was, in the Roman mind, linked to the purity of the regime. To debase the coin was to debase the trust between emperor and subject, to announce that the word of the princeps, stamped on every denarius, was worth less than it had been the day before. The provincial elites, who held their wealth in Roman silver, experienced the debasement as a direct confiscation. The senatorial class, which understood monetary policy better than it is sometimes given credit for, saw the debasement as a symptom of fiscal desperation. And fiscal desperation in a system where the emperor's solvency was the state's solvency was a crisis of legitimacy. Nero did not see this. He could not see this. He was building his golden house and planning his tour of Greece, and the distance between his aesthetic ambitions and the empire's fiscal reality was growing wider by the month, and there was no one left in the room who would tell him. Murs, there is a moment in every autocracy when the ruler's private desires and the state's public needs diverge so completely that the system itself begins to fracture, not from external assault, but from internal incoherence. For Nero, that moment arrived not with the fire, not with the golden house, but with Greece. In the year 66, Nero announced that he would tour Greece. He would compete in the great athletic and artistic festivals, the Olympic Games, the Pythian Games, the Isthmian Games, the Nemean Games, performing as a singer, a poet, a citharist, and a chariot driver. He would not compete as emperor. He would compete as an artist, submitting himself to the judgment of the Greek audiences he had admired since childhood, seeking the laurel wreaths that were, in his hierarchy of values, worth more than any military triumph. The tour lasted over a year. Nero competed in every major festival. He won every competition he entered. He was awarded 1,808 first prizes. The victories were, of course, fraudulent. The competitions were rescheduled to accommodate his visit, Trier. The Olympics were moved from their traditional date to fit Nero's itinerary, a disruption of a cycle that had been maintained for 8 centuries. Judges who might have rendered honest verdicts were replaced with men who understood that the emperor's artistic self-image was not a subject for objective evaluation. Competing performers withdrew rather than risk the consequences of defeating the ruler of the known world. In the chariot race at Olympia, Nero drove a team of 10 horses, fell from the chariot during the race, failed to complete the course, and was nevertheless awarded first prize on the grounds that he would certainly have won had he not fallen. The Greek audiences, to their credit, played along with sufficient enthusiasm that Nero took the performances as genuine validation. The Greeks were, in this period, a subject people whose cultural prestige far exceeded their political power, and they understood that flattering the emperor's artistic pretensions was a form of diplomacy that might yield tangible benefits. It did. Nero, in a grand gesture at the Isthmian Games, proclaimed the liberation of Greece, the exemption of the Greek provinces from Roman taxation, a gift of such extraordinary generosity that it stunned the assembled audience and, when news reached Rome, stunned the Senate as well. The liberation was reversed by Nero's successor almost immediately. It was a gesture, not a policy. An artist's gift to his audience, offered in the afterglow of applause, without consideration of its fiscal consequences. But for Nero, it was one of the defining moments of his life. He had stood before the people he admired most, the inheritors of the civilization he valued above his own, and he had given them the gift that mattered most to him, freedom. That the freedom was his to give only because his armies had taken it away was a contradiction he either did not see or did not consider relevant. While Nero sang in Greece, the empire began to come apart. In Judea, a revolt erupted in the year 66, a full-scale military rebellion driven by a combination of religious nationalism, Roman administrative brutality, and the specific grievances of a population that had been pushed past its tolerance by decades of extraction and cultural insensitivity. The revolt would ultimately require 4 years and the commitment of multiple legions to suppress. It would culminate in the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem in the year 70, an event of such shattering consequence for Jewish history that its reverberations have not ceased, and it would produce, in the historian Josephus, one of our most valuable sources for the period. But in 66, as the rebellion gathered force and the provincial garrison proved inadequate to contain it, the emperor of Rome was in Corinth, singing the role of Oedipus to a theater full of Greeks who dared not leave until the performance was over. Nero appointed Vespasian Racine, a competent general of undistinguished birth and unpretentious manner, to handle the Jewish war. The appointment was sensible. It was also, in retrospect, the decision that destroyed the Julio-Claudian dynasty, because Vespasian was the kind of man who, once given legions, understood what legions were for, but that was later. For now the war was delegated, and Nero returned to his competitions. Back in Rome, the situation was deteriorating in ways that would have been visible to any emperor who was present to see them. The treasury was depleted. The provinces were restive. The senatorial class, which had tolerated Nero's artistic indulgences as long as the empire was competently managed, was now confronting the reality that the empire was not being competently managed, that no one was managing it at all, that the emperor had left for Greece with most of his court and was showing no sign of returning, and that the administrative machinery, robust as it was, could not run indefinitely without someone at the center making decisions. Tigellinus, left behind as Nero's proxy, managed the situation with the only tool he possessed: fear. Treason trials resumed. Senators were accused, tried, and executed on charges that ranged from the plausible to the absurd. Property was confiscated. Informers were rewarded. The atmosphere in Rome became, by the accounts that survive, suffocating, a city holding its breath, waiting for the emperor to return or the empire to break, whichever came first. It was in this atmosphere, this gathering storm of fiscal crisis, military rebellion, administrative neglect, and senatorial terror, that the conspiracy took root. Not one conspiracy, but several, overlapping, poorly coordinated, driven less by ideology than by the accumulated desperation of men who had concluded that the current arrangement could not continue, and who could see no mechanism within the existing system for changing it, because this was the flaw that Augustus had built into the machine. There was no constitutional procedure for removing an emperor. There was no impeachment, no vote of no confidence, no legal mechanism by which the Senate could declare the throne vacant and select a replacement. The emperor served for life. The only way to end his service was to end his life. And the men who were now contemplating that act, provincial governors, senatorial grandees, military commanders, were not revolutionaries. They were not trying to destroy the system. They were trying to save it. They were trying to do the thing the system made impossible: remove a ruler who was destroying the state without destroying the state in the process. They would fail. They would all fail. And the failure would cost more lives than the tyranny it sought to end. But in the autumn of 67, as Nero loaded his 1,808 victory wreaths onto ships bound for Italy and prepared to return to Rome in triumph, entering the city through a breach in the wall, in the manner of a conquering general, riding in Augustus's own triumphal chariot, wearing a purple robe and an Olympic crown, scattering flowers before him while the crowds cheered or were compelled to cheer. The conspiracies were still forming, still finding their shape, still waiting for the moment when calculation would overcome fear, and the men who ran the empire's armies would decide, one by one and then all at once, that the boy who had become emperor at 16 had finally irrevocably ceased to be one. That moment was coming. It was less than a year away. The rebellion began not in Rome, but at the edges. This is how empires come apart. Not from the center, where the institutions are strongest and the inertia most powerful, but from the periphery, where the legions are stationed and the governors have learned to think of their provinces as personal fiefdoms and their soldiers as personal armies. Augustus had understood this danger. It was the reason he kept the most powerful military commands within the imperial family, the reason provincial governors served at the emperor's pleasure rather than the Senate's, the reason the Praetorian Guard existed at all, a force stationed in Rome whose primary purpose was not to defend the city but to ensure that no provincial army could seize it. The system worked as long as the emperor maintained the loyalty of the key commanders. It worked as long as the center held. By the spring of 68, the center was not holding. The first to move was Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, Central Gaul, the heartland of what is now France. Vindex was not a traditional Roman aristocrat. He was of Gallic descent, from a family that had received Roman citizenship within living memory, and his position as governor of a major province was itself evidence of the empire's capacity to absorb and elevate provincial talent. He was also, by the accounts that survive, a man of genuine conviction. Not merely an opportunist seeking the throne for himself, but someone who believed or claimed to believe that Nero's reign had become intolerable and that the Roman state deserved better. In March of 68, Vindex raised the standard of revolt. He did not claim the purple for himself. He lacked the legions, the lineage, and the ambition for that. Instead, he sent letters to the governors of neighboring provinces, inviting them to join a movement to replace Nero with a worthier candidate. The letter he sent to Servius Sulpicius Galba, the 71-year-old governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, was the one that mattered. Galba was everything Nero was not. He was old, austere, aristocratic in the deepest Roman sense, a man of ancient family, rigid personal discipline, and a military record that stretched back nearly half a century. He had served under Tiberius, under Caligula, under Claudius, and under Nero, accumulating honors and commands with the patient diligence of a man who understood that survival in the imperial system required competence without conspicuousness. He had governed Africa. He had commanded legions on the Rhine. He had administered Spain for 8 years with a severity that earned him respect from the army and fear from the provincials, which in Roman terms amounted to roughly the same thing. He was also, by 68, afraid for his life. Nero's agents had been thinning the ranks of prominent men with increasing frequency, and Galba, wealthy, respected, commanding a province with significant military resources, Mraidor, was precisely the kind of figure who attracted imperial suspicion simply by existing. Vindex's letter offered him a choice: wait to be summoned to Rome on fabricated charges and die in the manner of so many senators before him, or act and accept whatever followed. Galba chose to act. In April of 68, he declared himself not emperor but legatus senatus ac populi Romani, representative of the Senate and people of Rome. The title was carefully chosen. It avoided the presumption of claiming the throne while simultaneously asserting that the throne's current occupant no longer represented the legitimate Roman state. It was a constitutional fiction, but it was a useful one. It gave senators and commanders who were hesitant about outright rebellion a legalistic framework within which to justify their defection. Nero learned of Vindex's revolt while still in Greece, or shortly after his return. His initial reaction, according to Suetonius, was not alarm, but irritation. Irritation that someone was disrupting his artistic triumph. Irritation that the rebellion was forcing him to attend to the tedious business of governance when he wanted to be rehearsing. Suetonius reports that Nero's primary concern upon hearing of Vindex's revolt was that Vindex had mocked his singing. This detail is almost certainly exaggerated for effect. Suetonius was constructing a portrait of a ruler so disconnected from reality that personal vanity had eclipsed political survival. But even if the specific detail is invention, the broader characterization carries weight. Multiple sources agree that Nero's response to the gathering crisis was slow, erratic, and marked by the same confusion of priorities that had defined his later reign. He gave orders and countermanded them. He proposed campaigns and abandoned them. He announced that he would go to Gaul and defeat the rebels by standing before them and weeping, which would cause them to repent, after which he would sing a victory ode that he had already begun composing. Whether Nero actually said this or whether it is another of the set pieces that the hostile sources constructed to illustrate his derangement is unknowable. What is knowable is that the response was inadequate. The military machinery that a competent emperor would have activated, redeployment of legions, appointment of loyal commanders, rapid communication with provincial governors to assess their loyalties, was either activated too late or not activated at all. The situation shifted in May. Lucius Virginius Rufus, the governor of Upper Germany, marched his legions south to confront Vindex. The two forces met near Vesontio, modern Besançon, and the engagement that followed was either a battle or a catastrophic misunderstanding depending on which account you trust. Virginius Rufus may have intended to negotiate. His soldiers, facing a Gallic force that they regarded as barbarian rebels regardless of Roman constitutional niceties, attacked without waiting for orders. Vindex's forces were destroyed. Vindex himself, in the aftermath, took his own life. The rebellion, it seemed, was over before it had properly begun. But it was not over. Vindex was dead, but the conditions that had produced him, the fiscal crisis, the administrative neglect, the growing consensus among the empire's military commanders that Nero could not be sustained or had not died with him. And Galba in Spain was still in the field. He had declared himself, however cautiously, an alternative to the reigning emperor. He could not undeclare himself. The only directions available to him were forward toward Rome and the throne, or backward toward trial and execution. Men in that position do not go backward. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in how power dissolves. It does not shatter like glass. It melts, like ice in warming water, slowly and then all at once. Individual commanders, individual governors, individual units made individual calculations about their own survival and their own advantage, and one by one, the calculations pointed in the same direction. Nero had no children. He had no designated heir. He had alienated the Senate, debased the currency, emptied the treasury, and critically, he had lost the personal loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, whose prefect Tigellinus was ill, and whose troops had not been paid with the regularity that bought their devotion. The Guard's defection was the end. Everything else, the provincial revolts, the senatorial conspiracies, the military calculations of distant governors, was prologue. The Praetorian Guard was the only armed force in Rome. Their loyalty was the physical reality that underlay the constitutional fiction of the Principate. Without them, the emperor was a man in a large house with a title that meant nothing. The prefect who replaced the ailing Tigellinus was Nymphidius Sabinus, a man of murky origins and transparent ambitions who saw in the crisis an opportunity that smaller men would have missed. Nymphidius went to the Praetorian barracks and told the soldiers that Nero had already fled, which was not yet true, and that Galba had promised them a donative of 30,000 sesterces per man if they transferred their allegiance. The amount was staggering, far beyond what the treasury could sustain, and there is no evidence that Galba had actually promised it. But the soldiers did not ask for evidence. They wanted to be on the winning side, and Nymphidius was telling them which side that was. On the night of June 8th, the Guard declared for Galba. Nero was in the palace. The accounts of his final hours are detailed enough to suggest that someone close to him survived to tell the story, though the theatrical quality of the details also suggests embellishment. He was awakened, or woke himself, sometime after midnight to find the palace empty. The guards were gone. The servants were gone. The courtiers who had filled his halls for 14 years, who had applauded his singing and praised his poetry and told him daily that he was the greatest artist the world had ever produced, had vanished into the Roman night, taking with them whatever they could carry of the palace furnishings. He wandered the corridors. He called for his companions. No one answered. He sent messengers to the barracks of the guard. The messengers did not return. He went to the rooms of his friends Suetonius named several, and found them vacant. The beds were made. The personal effects were gone. They had left while he slept, or while he was elsewhere in the vast deserted house, calculating the exact moment at which loyalty to a falling emperor became a liability rather than a virtue. He considered his options. He could flee to Parthia, Rome's great eastern rival, and throw himself on the mercy of the Parthian king, who had after all admired him or claimed to. He could go to Egypt, where his popularity might sustain him. He could present himself to the Roman people in the Forum wearing mourning clothes and beg their forgiveness with a speech so moving that they would be compelled by its artistry to restore him. He could, if all else failed, become a professional citharist, earn his living by the art that had always mattered more to him than the empire. These plans were not practical. They were fantasies, the projections of a mind that had spent 14 years in an environment where fantasy and reality were not required to be different things. The man who had been told since the age of 16 that his wishes were commands was discovering in a single night that his wishes had never been commands at all. They had been requests, honored by men who found it profitable to honor them, and the profitability had expired. The few freedmen who remained, Epaphroditus, Phaon, Sporus, a small handful of servants whose loyalty or inertia had outlasted their self-interest, urged him to flee. Phaon offered his villa a few miles outside the city as a hiding place. Nero agreed. He put on a cloak, covered his face, mounted a horse, and rode out of Rome in the dark. He was barefoot. The sources are specific about this. Read Deer. His feet were unshod, and the ride through the outskirts of the city took him through rough ground that cut and scratched his skin. The detail recurs across multiple accounts, with a consistency that suggests it was either witnessed or invented by someone who understood its symbolic weight. The Emperor of Rome, who had walked on marble and been carried in litters and worn sandals of gilded leather, was riding barefoot through thorn bushes, fleeing the city he had rebuilt, heading for a freedman's villa to hide from the soldiers who had once been his. The ride took several hours. Along the way, an earthquake shook the ground. The sources record this as fact, not metaphor, and seismic activity in the region around Rome was common enough that the detail is plausible. Nero took it as an omen. He took everything as an omen. He had always been superstitious, in the way that people who believe themselves to be the protagonists of a cosmic narrative tend to be superstitious, interpreting the natural world as a commentary on their personal drama, reading significance into coincidence, hearing the voice of fate in the trembling of the earth. They reached Phaon's villa at dawn. The approach was through the back, across rough terrain, to avoid being seen from the road. Nero crawled through a narrow passage, some sources say a tunnel, others say a gap in a wall, into the villa's interior. He was offered bread. He refused it. He was offered water. He drank, but complained about its temperature. Even here, even now, the habits of the palace persisted. The body remembered luxury even when the mind was preparing for death. Inside the villa, the small group waited. Nero ordered a grave dug in the courtyard, his own grave to his specifications, which involved measurements of his body to ensure the pit was the correct size. While the grave was being prepared, he wept. He repeated, to whoever was present and willing to listen, his assessment of the situation. Qualis artifex pereo. What an artist dies in me. The phrase which we encountered at the opening of this account is the most famous thing Nero ever said. It is also, in its way, the most honest. Not because it was true. Whether Nero was a genuinely gifted artist or merely an emperor whose audiences lacked the option of honest criticism is a question the evidence cannot resolve, but because it was sincere. In his final hours, facing the extinction of everything he had been given and everything he had built, Nero did not mourn the loss of his empire. He mourned the loss of his art. He did not regret the murders, the persecutions, the debasements, the million-odd decisions, large and small, that had brought him to this room in this villa on this morning. He regretted that he would never perform again. that the voice would be silenced, that the music would stop. This was either the purest expression of an artist's soul or the most complete evidence of a sociopath's self-absorption. And the fact that it can be read both ways, that both readings are defensible, that neither exhausts the statement, is perhaps the most Neronian thing about it. He was, to the end, a man who could not be reduced to a single interpretation. The monster and the artist occupied the same body, and neither had the decency to step aside so the other could be seen clearly. Word arrived. The Senate had declared Nero a public enemy, hostis publicus, and had ordered that he be punished in the ancient manner. The ancient manner, his companions informed him, involved being stripped naked, having his head locked in a wooden fork, and being beaten to death with rods. The information concentrated his mind. He picked up the dagger. He pressed it to his throat. He could not push it in. He asked his companions to kill themselves first to show him how it was done, to demonstrate that the act was possible. They refused. He called for a gladiator, someone professionally trained in the mechanics of killing Moar, to come and dispatch him. No gladiator came. He berated himself for his cowardice, again in Greek, asking whether his behavior was fitting for Nero, telling himself that this was a disgrace, that this was not the time for deliberation, that he must act, he could not act. The sound of horses reached the villa. The riders the Senate had sent were close enough that their hoofbeats were audible in the morning stillness, close enough that the question of whether Nero would die by his own hand or theirs was now measured in minutes. Epaphroditus, the freedman, stepped forward. He placed his hand over Nero's on the dagger. He guided the blade. Whether he pushed or merely steadied or applied the critical pressure that Nero's own wrist could not supply, the sources do not agree. What they agree on is the result. The blade entered the throat. The blood came. Nero was not yet dead when the first rider reached the villa. A centurion entered the room, saw the emperor on the floor, and attempted to stanch the wound with his cloak, either out of genuine loyalty, or because a living emperor was worth more than a dead one, or because the habits of military service overrode the political calculations that had brought him there. The gesture was futile. The wound was mortal. Nero looked at the centurion. His eyes, those dull, blue, myopic eyes that had squinted at the world for 30 years, focused on the soldier's face. His last words, according to Suetonius, were, "Too late." This is fidelity. The irony was deliberate. The man who had been betrayed by everyone, by his guard, his senate, his governors, his generals, the entire apparatus of power that had sustained him and that he had sustained for, recognized loyalty only in the single soldier who arrived too late to provide it. The comment was bitter, self-aware, and perfectly composed. Even in death, Nero was performing. He died on June 9th, in the year 68 of the Common Era. He was 30 years old. He had ruled for 13 years and 8 months. He was the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the line that had governed Rome for nearly a century, from Augustus through Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. With his death, the dynasty that had invented the Principate was extinguished, and the question of who would replace it, the question that Augustus had never solved, that the system had never developed a mechanism to answer, was thrown open for the first time since the civil wars that had ended the Republic. The answer, as it turned out, was civil war. The year that followed Nero's death, the year 69, which the historian Tacitus would later call the year of the four emperors, was the most violent succession crisis the Roman state had experienced since the fall of the Republic. It demonstrated with a clarity that no one could ignore the fundamental instability of the system Augustus had built. The Principate functioned beautifully as long as the succession was orderly. When the succession was contested, the Principate was not a constitution, but a prize, and the legions were not a defense force, but a weapon that could be wielded by anyone with the ambition and the luck to wield it. Galba reached Rome first. He had the Senate's endorsement, the guard's nominal allegiance, and the legitimacy of having been the first to challenge Nero openly. He also had the political instincts of a stone. Within months, He had alienated nearly every constituency that mattered. He refused to pay the donative that Nymphidius had promised the guardian armorers, not because the treasury could not afford it, though it could not, but because Galba believed in fiscal discipline and could not bring himself to buy what he felt he had earned. The principle was admirable. The timing was suicidal. Soldiers who have been promised money and do not receive it are not moved by lectures on fiscal responsibility. They are moved to find an emperor who will pay them. Galba also managed to alienate the Senate by executing prominent men without trial, antagonize the provincial armies by distributing rewards and punishments according to a logic that no one outside his immediate circle could follow, and fatally undermine his own position by adopting as his heir a young aristocrat named Lucius Calpurnius Piso Frugi Licinianus, a man of impeccable pedigree and no political base, chosen for his lineage rather than his capacity to command loyalty from anyone who had not read his family tree. The adoption was announced on January 10th, 69. 5 days later, Galba was murdered in the Forum by soldiers loyal to Marcus Salvius Otho, a former friend of Nero's, a man of considerable charm and negligible scruples who had calculated that if Galba would not reward the guard, someone else should, and that someone else might as well be himself. Otho lasted 3 months. He was a competent enough politician and a surprisingly decent human being. The sources, even the hostile ones, note his personal courage and his willingness to sacrifice himself rather than prolong a civil war he was losing. But he had seized power through assassination, and the precedent he had set was immediately replicated by a more powerful claimant. Aulus Vitellius, the governor of Lower Germany, had been proclaimed emperor by his legions even before Galba's death, and his army, Darfur, the battle-hardened Rhine legions, the finest fighting force in the empire, was already marching south through Italy when Otho's accession was announced. The armies met at the First Battle of Bedriacum, near modern Cremona, in April of 69. Otho's forces were defeated. Otho, true to the personal courage the sources credit him with, did not flee. He retired to his quarters and killed himself with a single clean thrust of a dagger, accomplishing in one motion what Nero, with far more reason and far less courage, had been unable to accomplish at all. Vitellius reached Rome and assumed the purple. He was, by all accounts, a man of enormous appetites and limited capacities, a glutton whose feasts became legendary even in a culture that prized excess, and a ruler whose administrative contributions were negligible. He held the throne for 8 months, during which time the Eastern Legion, the armies in Judea, Syria, and Egypt, the largest concentration of military force in the empire, declared for their own candidate, Vespasian, the same Vespasian whom Nero had appointed to suppress the Jewish revolt. The competent, unassuming general from an undistinguished family who had been given legions because he was the kind of man no one considered a threat. He had been fighting in Judea for 2 years, methodically reducing the rebel strongholds, demonstrating the kind of professional military competence that Roman soldiers valued above all other qualities in a commander. When the Eastern legions declared for him in July of 69, it was not because Vespasian had sought the throne, but because the throne was falling and the soldiers who held the real power, the power of organized, disciplined violence, looked at the available options and chose the one who could actually govern. The forces of Vespasian, commanded by his lieutenant Antonius Primus, met the forces of Vitellius at the Second Battle of Bedriacum in October. Vitellius's army was destroyed. Vitellius himself was dragged from a hiding place in Rome. Some sources say a doorkeeper's lodge, others say a closet, and killed in the street, his body mutilated and thrown into the Tiber. 4 emperors in 18 months, Galba murdered by the guard, Otho dead by his own hand, Vitellius killed by a mob. Only Vespasian survived, and he survived because he had what the others lacked: legions that believed in him, an administration that could function, and the political intelligence to learn from the mistakes of the men who had preceded him. The year of the 4 emperors revealed with brutal clarity the truth that Augustus's system had been designed to conceal. that the Roman Empire was a military dictatorship, and that the question of who held power was decided not by law, not by tradition, not by the Senate's deliberations, but by the willingness of armed men to kill and die for one claimant rather than another. The system could produce good government. It had under Augustus, under the early Claudius, under the early Nero. But it could not survive a contested succession without bloodshed because it contained no mechanism for resolving such contests peacefully. Nero had not created this flaw. He had inherited it. But his reign had exposed it as no previous reign had because he was the first emperor to be overthrown, the first to demonstrate that the principate could be taken away as well as given, that the immunity of the purple was conditional, that an emperor who lost the loyalty of the army was not an emperor at all, but a man in a large house waiting for the soldiers to arrive. The lesson was not lost on his successors. Every emperor who followed Nero understood on some level that his tenure was secured not by constitutional authority, but by the continued willingness of the military to sustain it. This understanding shaped Roman governance for the next 4 centuries, producing on the one hand a tradition of military competence and administrative pragmatism that kept the empire functioning through crises that would have destroyed a lesser state, and on the other, a chronic instability of succession that would, over the long term, prove fatal. Nero did not intend any of this. He did not think in structural terms. He did not analyze the constitutional implications of his own behavior. He was a man who wanted to sing and who happened to hold a position that required him to govern, and who resolved the contradiction by abandoning the governance in favor of the singing, and who discovered too late that the world does not organize itself around the needs of the performer, but the consequences of his reign, the structural consequences, the ones that operated beneath the level of individual intention, shaped the Roman state for generations. The year of the 4 emperors taught Rome that power was contestable. The Flavian dynasty that followed taught Rome that power could be stabilized by competence. The long sequence of adoptive emperors in the 2nd century, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius, taught Rome that succession by merit rather than by blood could produce a period of governance so effective that Edward Gibbon would later call it the happiest age in human history. All of this grew from the wreckage Nero left behind. The reforms were responses to his failures. The solutions were answers to his problems. The empire that emerged from the year of the 4 emperors was, in many ways, the empire that Nero's catastrophe had made necessary. An empire that had learned through blood and fire that it could not afford another Nero, and that built, imperfectly and incompletely, the institutional safeguards that might prevent one. He could not have known this. He was dead in a freedman's villa with a blade in his throat and his freedman's hand on the hilt. The future he had made possible was invisible to him, as all futures are invisible to the people who make them. He saw only the dagger, the blood, the centurion's cloak, the morning light coming through the windows of a house that was not his, and the empire he had shattered was already, in the hands of harder and more practical men, beginning to rebuild itself. But before the rebuilding, there was the remembering, and the remembering was not kind. The destruction of Nero's memory began before his body was cold. It began, in fact, while the blood was still pooling on the floor of Phaon's villa, while the centurion's cloak was still pressed uselessly against the wound, while the freedmen who had attended his final hours were still calculating whether their proximity to the dead emperor was an asset or a liability. The Senate acted with a speed that betrayed how long its members had been waiting for this moment. Nero was declared a public enemy, hostis, a legal status that stripped him posthumously of every honor, every title, every legal protection the state had ever conferred. His statues were to be pulled down. His inscriptions were to be chiseled from the stone. His name was to be erased from public monuments. The process had a name, damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory, though the phrase itself is a modern scholarly coinage rather than an ancient legal term. The practice was older than the Republic. It was Rome's way of killing a person twice, once in the body and once in the record, eliminating not merely the man, but the evidence that the man had existed. The practice was never as thorough as it was intended to be. Nero's name survives on inscriptions that were overlooked or protected by distance from the capital. His coins remained in circulation. You cannot recall a currency without replacing it, and the treasury was in no condition to mint replacements. His buildings, though stripped of their most ostentatious features, could not be demolished entirely without destroying the infrastructure that Rome depended on. The Domus Aurea was buried, literally buried, filled with earth and rubble, and built over by Nero's successors who constructed the Colosseum in the Depression, where his artificial lake had been, in the baths of Titus over the wings of his palace. The gesture was pointed. The space that Nero had claimed for his private pleasure was returned to the Roman people as public entertainment and public hygiene. But the burial was not erasure. The rooms of the Domus Aurea survived beneath the new construction, sealed in darkness, their painted walls and gilded ceilings preserved by the very soil that was meant to obliterate them. 15 centuries later, in the Renaissance, Roman workmen accidentally broke through into the buried chambers, and the painters who lowered themselves on ropes into the underground room, Raphael among them, found the frescoes still vivid, still luminous, still carrying the aesthetic vision of an emperor who had been dead for 1,400 years. The decorative style they found there, which they called grottish because they discovered it in what appeared to be grottos, influenced the visual language of the Renaissance, and through it, the decorative traditions of the entire Western world. Nero's art outlasted his memory. His aesthetic survived the damnation that was meant to destroy it. The irony is almost too precise to bear. The man who wanted above all things to be remembered as an artist was condemned to be remembered as a monster, and yet the art persisted, anonymous, underground, waiting in the dark for someone to come looking. No one came looking for Nero himself. Or rather, the people who came looking were not the ones the Senate expected. The common people of Rome mourned him. This fact is attested by every major source, and it is, for the senatorial historians who recorded it, a source of evident discomfort. Tacitus mentions it with the clipped disdain of a man forced to acknowledge something he finds distasteful. Suetonius records it with his usual cataloging precision. The evidence is consistent. For years after Nero's death, flowers appeared on his grave. His images were displayed in public places. People who had lived through his reign spoke of it with a nostalgia that baffled and infuriated the elite classes who had engineered his fall. The explanation is not mysterious, though it requires a willingness to see the Roman world through eyes other than those of the senatorial class that produced our sources. Nero had been, for the common people, a generous emperor. His grain distributions during and after the fire were remembered. His public entertainments, were the games, the theatrical performances, the spectacles in the arena, and the circus, were lavish and frequent, and they served a function that went beyond mere distraction. In a city where the gap between rich and poor was immense and visible, where senatorial families owned estates larger than some provinces, while freedmen and laborers lived 6 to a room in tenements that swayed in the wind, the emperor's public generosity was the closest thing to redistribution the system offered. Nero gave the people bread. He gave them circuses. He gave them, in his public performances, the spectacle of an emperor who seemed to care more about their approval than about the senate's, who sought their applause rather than the aristocracy's respect, who was willing, scandalously, thrillingly willing, to step down from the elevation of his office and stand on the same stage where actors and musicians performed for common audiences. The Senate found this degrading. The people found it intoxicating. The difference in perspective was not incidental, it was structural, rooted in the fundamentally different relationships that different classes had with the imperial system. For the Senate, the emperor was a colleague who had accumulated too much power, a first among equals who had ceased to behave as an equal. For the common people, the emperor was a patron, a protector, the one man in the system whose power was great enough to counterbalance the collective weight of the aristocracy. A strong emperor who humiliated the Senate was not, from the perspective of a Roman shopkeeper or dock worker, a tyrant. He was a champion. This is not to excuse Nero's crimes or to romanticize his relationship with the Roman populace. The people who mourned him did not know, or did not care about, the details of Agrippina's murder, Britannicus's poisoning, Octavia's execution, the treason trials, the confiscations, the judicial murders that had thinned the senatorial ranks. These events occurred in the sealed world of the court, among people the common citizen never met, in rooms the common citizen never entered. The Nero they knew was the Nero of the public spectacles, the Nero of the grain distributions, the Nero who sang in the theater of Pompey and drove chariots in the Circus Maximus, and who seemed, in his eagerness for their love, more human than any emperor before him. Their mourning was real. Their perspective was partial. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the historian who dismisses either one in favor of the other is not doing history but advocacy. The mourning took forms that the new regime found alarming. In the eastern provinces, Greece, Asia Minor, the territories where Nero's tour had left the strongest impression and where his liberation of Greece was still remembered, false Neros began to appear. The phenomenon is remarkable in its persistence. At least 3 separate impostors claimed to be Nero in the decades following his death, each attracting significant followings, each exploiting the same narrative. The emperor had not really died. He had escaped, gone into hiding, and would return to reclaim his throne and punish those who had betrayed him. The first appeared in the year 69, barely a year after Nero's death. A slave or freedman who bore a physical resemblance to the dead emperor and who gathered a following among sailors and soldiers in the Aegean. He was quickly suppressed. The second appeared around 80 during the reign of Titus, and made enough of an impression that the Parthian Empire, Rome's rival to the east, considered supporting his claim. The third, and most significant, appeared around 88 during the reign of Domitian, and was taken seriously enough by the Parthian king Artabanus that he nearly precipitated a diplomatic crisis between the two empires. The false Neros were not random occurrences, they were symptoms of a specific phenomenon: the refusal of certain populations to accept the official narrative of Nero's death and the official judgment of his reign. In the eastern provinces, where Nero's Philhellenism and generosity had been experienced directly, the senatorial verdict on his character did not match the lived experience of his rule. The gap between the two, between what the history said and what the people remembered, created the space in which impostors could operate. The false Neros flourished not because the eastern populations were credulous, but because they had reasons to prefer a different version of history than the one being imposed from Rome. The Parthian connection is particularly revealing. Nero had maintained peaceful relations with Parthia throughout his reign, a diplomatic achievement of considerable significance given that the Parthian frontier was the most dangerous and expensive military commitment the empire faced. The settlement of the Armenian question in 63, which established a compromise that both empires could accept, was among the most successful diplomatic arrangements of the first century. The Parthian king Vologases had sent ambassadors to Rome to express his admiration for Nero, and when news of Nero's death reached the Parthian court, Vologases reportedly proposed that the Roman Senate honor his memory. This detail, a foreign king mourning a Roman emperor whom the Roman Senate had condemned, captures something essential about the gap between Nero's domestic reputation and his international one. Within Rome, among the class that wrote the histories, Nero was a monster. Outside Rome, among the powers that dealt with him as a head of state, he was a capable diplomat whose reign had produced stability on the empire's most volatile frontier. The two assessments are not contradictory. They are views of the same man from different angles, and the fact that one has survived and the other has been largely forgotten tells us more about who controlled the historical narrative than about who Nero actually was. The narrative that survived. the Nero of Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, was shaped by specific political needs and specific literary conventions, and it is worth pausing at this distance from the events themselves to examine how those needs and conventions produced the figure we have inherited. The Flavian dynasty, Vespasian, Titus, Domitian, needed Nero to be terrible. Their legitimacy rested on the claim that they had rescued the empire from the catastrophe of the Julio-Claudian collapse, and the depth of the catastrophe was directly proportional to the value of the rescue. A Nero who was merely incompetent did not serve their purposes. They needed a Nero who was monstrous, whose crimes were so extreme, whose degeneracy was so complete that any replacement, however humble in origin, however lacking in dynastic credentials, represented an improvement so vast as to constitute a salvation. This is not to say that the crimes were invented. Agrippina was murdered. Britannicus was poisoned. Octavia was executed. The Christians were persecuted. These events happened. But the way they were framed, the motives that were attributed, the psychological interpretations that were layered over the fact, and these were constructions shaped by the needs of the moment, designed to produce not understanding but judgment. Consider the murder of Poppaea. The traditional account preserved in Suetonius states that Nero kicked his pregnant wife in the stomach during an argument, causing her death and the death of their unborn child. The story is told as a straightforward act of domestic violence, the culmination of Nero's brutality, the point at which his cruelty extended even to the woman he had killed his mother to marry. It is a devastating image, and it has adhered to Nero's reputation for 2,000 years. But Tacitus, who is generally more careful with evidence, gives a different account. He reports the kicking story as one possibility, but also notes that some sources claimed Poppaea was poisoned, a claim that makes less narrative sense, but that acknowledges at least that the ancient tradition was not unanimous. And the circumstances of the death. Poppaea died in 65, during the later, darker years of the reign, when Nero's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic, are consistent with any number of explanations, including complications of pregnancy, which killed women in the ancient world with a frequency that moderns find difficult to comprehend. A woman dying in the third trimester of pregnancy in the first century did not require a murderous husband to explain her death. She required only the ordinary dangers of childbirth in a world without antisepsis, without blood transfusion, without any of the interventions that would later make pregnancy survivable. We do not know what happened to Poppaea. We know what the sources say happened, and we know that the sources had reasons to say what they said. The distinction matters, not because Nero deserves the benefit of the doubt, but because the historical method demands that we distinguish between what can be established and what has been assumed, between the fact and the narrative that has accreted around it like calcium around a bone. The same analytical caution applies to the broader portrait. The Nero of the ancient sources is a figure of almost operatic villainy, a man who murders his mother, poisons his stepbrother, kicks his wife to death, burns his city, persecutes an innocent religious minority, castrates a boy to make him a bride, performs on stage in defiance of every social norm, and finally dies whimpering in a freedman's house, unable to summon the courage to kill himself. The portrait is vivid, coherent, and dramatically satisfying. It is also suspiciously complete. Suspiciously, because real human beings are not this coherent. Real lives do not arrange themselves into such neat narrative arcs, and real villainy is rarely so unrelieved by contradiction. The contradictions exist, but you have to look for them in the margins of the hostile accounts, in the details that the historians included despite their narrative inconvenience. Nero's early reforms, the tax reductions, the legal protections, the consultative relationship with the Senate, are acknowledged by the same sources that condemn his later tyranny, because the facts were too well known to suppress. His response to the fire, the emergency relief, the building regulations, the rational urban planning, however, is described even by Tacitus, who clearly wishes it were not true. His diplomatic successes, Shoromoina, the Armenian settlement, the maintenance of peace on the Parthian frontier, are recorded in the provincial sources even when they are minimized in the literary ones. His popularity with the common people is attested precisely because the historians find it embarrassing and feel compelled to explain it away. These fragments do not rehabilitate Nero. They do not transform a tyrant into a statesman or a murderer into a saint. What they do is complicate the portrait, introduce the static, the noise, the contradictory data points that real lives contain and that literary constructions smooth away. The historical Nero was not the Nero of the sources. He was not the Nero of later Christian demonology. He was not the Nero of Renaissance painting or Hollywood film. He was a person, flawed, gifted, damaged, dangerous, occasionally competent, frequently cruel, always performing. And the gap between the person and the legend is the space in which honest history must operate. There is another absence in the record that demands acknowledgement, and it is an absence so large that it threatens to swallow the story entirely if we look at it directly. The slaves. Nero's Rome was a slave society. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration, and it is a structural description of an economy and a social order built on the labor of human beings who were legally classified as property. Estimates of the slave population of the city of Rome in the first century vary, but the most commonly cited figures suggest that between 1/4 and 1/3 of the city's inhabitants were enslaved. In the empire as a whole, the proportion was lower but still vast. Millions of human beings whose labor produced the wealth that funded the legions, built the aqueducts, maintained the estates, served the meals, raised the children, copied the manuscripts, and performed every other function that the Roman elite considered beneath their personal dignity. These people are almost entirely invisible in the sources. They appear as instruments, a poisoner here, a food taster there, a freedman who offers his villa as a hiding place, a eunuch who guides the blade into the emperor's throat. They are named when their actions affect the narrative of the powerful. They are otherwise absent. Their experiences of Nero's reign, what it meant to be enslaved in a city that burned, what it meant to be ordered to applaud a performance you could not leave, what it meant to serve in a household where the master killed his mother and his wife, and might, on any given evening, decide to kill you. These experiences are not recorded. They are not even gestured at. The sources do not silence the slaves deliberately. The sources simply do not see them. In the way that a camera pointed at the stage does not see the audience, the absence is not correctable. We cannot reconstruct the inner lives of Nero's slaves from the available evidence. We cannot give them voices that the historical record denied them. We can only note the denial. Note that the story we have been telling, with all its dramatic complexity, its moral ambiguity, its careful attention to the perspectives of senators and generals and historians, is a story told entirely from within the tiny fraction of Roman society that had the literacy, the leisure, and the social position to produce written records. The remaining population, the slaves, the freedmen, the laborers, the women, the provincials, the vast majority of the human beings who lived under Nero's rule, experienced that rule in ways we cannot access. And their silence is not a gap in the record, but a feature of it, a structural consequence of a society that regarded most of its members as instruments rather than witnesses. When we say that the common people mourned Nero, we are speaking of the free poor, the citizens who attended the games and received the grain. We are not speaking of the enslaved, whose mourning or relief or indifference was not considered worth recording. When we say that the provincial populations remembered Nero favorably, we are speaking of the local elites whose inscriptions survive, the magistrates and priests and merchants who interacted with the imperial administration at a level that produced documentary evidence. We are not speaking of the peasants, the miners, the quarry workers, the galley rowers whose labor sustained the provinces, but whose opinion sustained nothing. This is the limitation of all ancient history, not merely the history of Nero, but it bears stating here in the context of a reign whose moral assessment has been debated for 2 millennia because the debate has always been conducted in terms set by the Roman elite. Was he good for the Senate? Was he good for the army? Was he good for the economy? Nimaon, and almost never in terms that would have been recognizable to the majority of the people who lived under his rule. The question of whether Nero was a good emperor depends entirely on whom you ask, and the people best positioned to answer it are the people least represented in the record. We proceed with this limitation acknowledged. We do not pretend to overcome it. The theological afterlife of Nero is, in some ways, more consequential than his actual life, a statement that would have appalled the man himself, but that the evidence compels. Within a generation of his death, Nero had been absorbed into the eschatological imagination of early Christianity as a figure of cosmic significance. The persecution of 64, which was localized, temporary, and motivated by political convenience rather than religious ideology, was transformed in Christian memory into the inaugural act of a war between the Roman state and the people of God, a war that would continue with varying intensity for 2.5 centuries until Constantine's conversion reversed the polarity of the relationship entirely. The identification of Nero with the Antichrist, or with one of the precursors of the Antichrist, Nero, became a fixed element of Christian apocalyptic literature by the late 1st century. The book of Revelation, composed probably in the 90s during the reign of Domitian, contains imagery that early Christian commentators consistently interpreted as referring to Nero. The beast from the sea, the number 666, the figure who persecutes the saints and who will return from apparent death to wage a final war against the faithful. The Nero Redivivus myth. The belief that Nero would return from the dead or from hiding in the east was not merely a political phenomenon exploited by impostors. It was a theological expectation, woven into the Christian understanding of the end times, carrying the weight of prophecy and divine revelation. The consequences of this theological identification are difficult to overstate. For 15 centuries, in every Christian culture from Ireland to Ethiopia, Nero was not merely a bad emperor. He was a figure of demonic significance, a servant of Satan, a harbinger of the apocalypse whose crimes against the early church placed him in a category of evil that transcended ordinary political judgment. The historical Nero, the complicated, damaged, occasionally competent Roman politician, was buried beneath the theological Nero as thoroughly as the Domus Aurea was buried beneath the baths of Titus. The man disappeared. The symbol endured, and the symbol shaped the way Western civilization thought about political power for a millennium and a half. The image of the tyrant as Antichrist, the ruler whose persecution of the faithful marks him as an agent of cosmic evil, became a template that was applied and reapplied to every subsequent ruler whom Christian communities wished to condemn. The medieval papacy used the Nero template against the Holy Roman emperors. The Protestant reformers used it against the Pope. English Puritans used it against Charles I. The template was infinitely adaptable because it was anchored not in specific political analysis but in theological narrative, a story about the eternal struggle between good and evil that could absorb any villain in any context. Nero would not have understood any of this. The Christians he persecuted in 64 were, from his perspective, a convenient scapegoat. A marginal, unpopular group whose destruction served an immediate political purpose and whose long-term significance was invisible to everyone in the 1st century, including probably the Christians themselves. He could not have known that the sect he used and discarded would, within 3 centuries, become the official religion of the empire he had ruled. He could not have known that his name would become, in the theology of that religion, a synonym for the forces of darkness. He could not have known that the fire, the persecution, and the memory of both would outlast every other element of his legacy, outlast his reforms, his diplomacy, his art, his buildings, his coins, his poetry, and that 2,000 years after his death, the first thing most people would know about him was that he was the emperor who burned the Christians. The gap between intention and consequence has never been wider than this. A man who wanted to be remembered as an artist is remembered as a persecutor. A political decision made to deflect blame for a fire became the foundational trauma of the world's largest religion. A scapegoating that lasted weeks produced a demonization that lasted millennia. This is what it means to say that history is not made by the people who live it. It is made by the people who survive it. and who tell the story afterward and who select from the wreckage of the past the fragments that serve their present needs. The Christians needed Nero to be a monster. The senators needed him to be a cautionary tale. The Flavian dynasty needed him to be a catastrophe from which they had rescued the state. Each group took the same raw material, a complicated man who ruled a complicated empire for 13 complicated years, and shaped it into the figure they required. The man himself vanished into the competing narratives, like a body sinking into deep water, visible for a moment and then gone. What remains when the narratives are stripped away, when the Christian Antichrist and the senatorial villain and the Flavian cautionary tale are set aside, is not a clear portrait, but a series of questions that the evidence raises without resolving. The first and most persistent of these questions is the one Nero himself would have considered the most important, and which history has been the least willing to take seriously. Was he any good? Not as an emperor, as an artist. The question sounds frivolous. It is not. Nero staked his identity on his artistic ability. He sacrificed his political credibility, his relationships, his mother, and ultimately his life in pursuit of recognition as a performer and a poet. The claim that animated his final hours, qualis artifex perio, was not a delusion of grandeur bolted onto a collapsing ego. It was, as far as we can reconstruct his inner life, his most deeply held belief about himself. If that belief was justified, if Nero possessed genuine talent, then the story of his reign acquires a dimension of tragedy that the hostile sources work hard to suppress. If it was not, if he was merely a powerful man forcing captive audiences to endure mediocrity, then the story is simpler and sadder and less interesting. The evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. We do not possess a single line of Nero's poetry. We do not possess a single note of his musical compositions. We possess descriptions of his performances, but these descriptions are filtered through the biases of historians who regarded the performances themselves as a scandal regardless of their quality. Tacitus does not evaluate Nero's singing. He evaluates the fact that an emperor sang. Suetonius catalogs the details of Nero's artistic training. The vocal exercises, the dietary restrictions, the lead plates worn on the chest to strengthen the diaphragm. With the same clinical precision he applies to the catalog of vices, treating the artistic discipline as one more symptom of a disordered personality rather than as evidence of genuine commitment. But there are fragments that suggest something more than imperial delusion. Nero trained seriously under professional musicians for years. He submitted to a regimen that professional singers of the period followed, a regimen that would have been unnecessary if the goal were merely to stand on stage and receive automatic applause. He restricted his diet, avoided foods that were believed to damage the voice, exercised according to protocols designed for performers rather than soldiers. He is reported to have been nervous before performances, genuinely, physically nervous, in the way that people who care about the quality of their work are nervous in ways that people who are merely going through the motions are not. The Greek audiences who heard him perform were, as we have noted, not in a position to offer honest criticism, but the consistency of the reports, the descriptions of extended performances, of competitions sustained over multiple rounds, of audiences that remained engaged for hours, suggests something beyond mere command attendance. An emperor who was genuinely terrible, who produced sounds that made listeners wince, would not have sustained multi-hour performances before audiences of thousands, however captive. The Greeks were too culturally sophisticated, too steeped in their own musical traditions, to have sat through hours of incompetent caterwauling without producing at least private commentary that would have survived in the record. That no such commentary survives, that the Greek response to Nero's performances, as far as we can reconstruct it, was enthusiastic rather than derisive, is not proof of genius, but it is suggestive of competence. The poetry presents a similar puzzle. Suetonius, who had access to the imperial archives and who was professionally disposed to collect damaging material, examined Nero's manuscripts and made a specific observation, that the notebooks showed evidence of genuine composition. crossings out, revisions, reworking, björg, rather than the clean transcription of lines dictated by professional ghostwriters. The detail is striking because Suetonius includes it in a context where he is trying to establish Nero's artistic pretensions as ridiculous. The evidence he found contradicted the narrative he was constructing, and he included it anyway, either out of archival honesty or because he did not recognize its implications. None of this makes Nero a great artist. It makes him a serious one, or a person who worked at his craft with a discipline that the dismissive accounts of the senatorial historians do not acknowledge. The gap between serious artist and great artist is vast, and the evidence does not permit us to determine where on that spectrum Nero fell. What we can say is that the caricature, the talentless narcissist forcing audiences to listen to his awful singing, does not survive contact with the evidence any better than the hagiography of a misunderstood genius would. The truth, as usual, occupies the uncomfortable middle ground where certainty cannot reach. There is a deeper question beneath the artistic one, and it is a question that extends far beyond Nero into the territory of political philosophy. Can a person be simultaneously a genuine artist and a genuine monster? Can the same sensibility that produces real beauty also produce real cruelty? The modern instinct is to say no, to assume that artistic sensitivity and moral sensitivity are correlated, that a person capable of creating something beautiful must also be capable of recognizing the ugliness of their own behavior. But the historical record offers no support for this assumption. It offers instead a long and uncomfortable catalog of gifted artists who were also terrible human beings, and the catalog extends from Nero's Rome to the present day with a consistency that suggests the two capacities are not merely independent but may, in certain configurations of personality and power, reinforce each other. Nero's artistic sensibility did not prevent his cruelty. It may have enabled it. The same capacity for aesthetic experience that allowed him to hear music in a way that moved him deeply also allowed him to conceive of human suffering as spectacle, to design the persecution of the Christians as a theatrical production, to stage the murder of his mother as a collapsing boat set piece, to experience his own downfall as a dramatic narrative in which he was simultaneously the protagonist and the audience. The boundary between art and cruelty, in a mind that experienced the world primarily through aesthetic categories, was not a boundary at all. It was a continuum. This is not an excuse. It is a diagnosis. And it is a diagnosis that implicates not merely Nero, but the system that produced him. A system that concentrated absolute power in the hands of a single individual, and then provided that individual with no framework, no institution, no countervailing force capable of distinguishing between creative expression and destructive compulsion. The Roman Principate did not merely fail to restrain Nero. It actively prevented him from being restrained because the mechanisms of restraint, the Senate's authority, the magistrate's independence, the legal protections that republican governance had provided, had been hollowed out by the same concentration of power that made Nero possible. Augustus built a system that could survive a competent tyrant. It could not survive an incompetent artist. The legacy of Nero's reign in the immediate term, the decades and centuries that followed his death, is a study in how political systems learn from catastrophe, and how the lessons they learn are always incomplete. The Flavian dynasty governed for 27 years, from 69 to 96. Vespasian was a builder and an administrator, pragmatic, fiscally conservative, personally unpretentious in a way that was itself a political statement after the excesses of the Julio-Claudians. He stabilized the currency, rebuilt the treasury, completed the suppression of the Jewish revolt, and initiated a construction program that included the Colosseum, the Flavian amphitheater, built on the site of Nero's artificial lake, returned to the Roman people as a venue for the public entertainments that Nero had tried to make private. The symbolism was deliberate and was meant to be legible. Where Nero had taken, the Flavians gave back. Vespasian's son Titus was brief and popular. 2 years on the throne, marked by the eruption of Vesuvius and another fire in Rome, both managed with a competence that earned him the Senate's genuine affection. His brother Domitian, who succeeded him, was something else entirely. A ruler whose final years descended into a paranoia and a reign of terror that the senatorial class experienced as a recurrence of everything they had feared since Nero. Domitian was assassinated in 96, the victim of a palace conspiracy that included his own wife, and the Senate once again breathed out and reached for a replacement. The replacement was Nerva, an elderly senator chosen for his respectability and his childlessness, and the system he inaugurated, adoption of the most capable available candidate as heir rather than hereditary succession, produced the sequence of rulers that history remembers as the five good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius. Their combined reigns spanned nearly a century, from 96 to 180, and represented the longest sustained period of competent governance the Roman Empire would experience. The system worked because each emperor chose his successor on the basis of ability rather than blood. It worked because the accidents of biology cooperated. None of the first four had surviving sons who could claim hereditary priority. It worked because the memory of what happened when the system failed, the memory of Nero, of the year of the four emperors of Domitian, remained vivid enough to discipline the choices of each successive ruler. And then Marcus Aurelius had a son, and the son was Commodus. And the cycle began again. The pattern, competent rulers followed by incompetent heirs, stability followed by crisis, reform followed by regression, would repeat with variations for the next 3 centuries, until the structural contradictions that Augustus had embedded in the system finally exceeded its capacity for self-correction, and the western half of the empire collapsed entirely. The eastern half, reconstituted as the Byzantine Empire, would continue for another millennium, but in a form so different from the Principate of the first century that Nero would not have recognized it as the same state. The point is not that Nero caused the fall of Rome. He did not. The empire endured for 4 centuries after his death, and the causes of its eventual dissolution were structural, demographic, economic, and military. Forces operating on scales of time and geography that no individual emperor could control. The point is that Nero's reign exposed the fault line in the system with a clarity that could not be ignored, and that the responses to that exposure, the Flavian reconstruction, the adoptive principle, the gradual professionalization of the imperial administration, were all attempts to solve the problem that Nero had personified. The problem was this: how do you build a government that depends on the quality of its ruler when you have no way of ensuring the quality of its ruler? Augustus's answer had been dynasty. Keep power in the family, train the heirs, hope for competence. Nero demonstrated the catastrophic failure mode of that answer. The Flavian answer was military meritocracy. Choose rulers from the officer class, men who had proven their capacity for command. Domitian demonstrated the failure mode of that answer. The adoptive answer was selection by the incumbent. Let each emperor choose the best available successor. Commodus demonstrated the failure mode of that answer. Every solution produced the same problem in a different form. The system required a good emperor. It could not guarantee one. And the consequences of a bad emperor, concentrated as they were in a single office with no constitutional checks, were catastrophic in proportion to the power the office held. This is the dilemma that Nero bequeathed to political philosophy, though he would not have recognized it as such and certainly would not have cared. The question of how to constrain executive power, how to build institutions that function regardless of the character of the person at their center, is the question that animates the entire subsequent history of Western governance. The Roman answer was the Principate. The medieval answer was feudalism and the church. The Enlightenment answer was constitutionalism, the separation of powers, the rule of law. Each was, in its way, a response to the Nero problem. What do you do when the person in charge is the problem? The American founders, who read their Tacitus and their Suetonius with the attention of men who believed the Roman experience was directly relevant to their own, designed their constitution with Nero, or figures like Nero, as explicitly in mind. The separation of powers, the system of checks and balances, the impeachment clause, the fixed terms of office, the Bill of Rights. These were all mechanisms designed to prevent the concentration of unchecked authority in a single individual. Mechanisms born from the study of what happened when such concentration was permitted. Whether those mechanisms are adequate to the task, and whether any mechanism is adequate to the task, is a question that every generation must answer for itself, and that the 21st century is answering in terms that the founders might have recognized with discomfort. Nero did not invent tyranny. He was not the first bad ruler, nor the worst, nor the most consequential, but he was the one who stuck, the one whose name became the word for the thing that civilization fears most about its own governing institutions. When we say Nero, we are not really talking about a man who lived in Rome 2,000 years ago. We are talking about a recurring possibility, the possibility that the systems we build to govern ourselves will produce from time to time a person whose private pathologies become public catastrophes, and that the systems themselves will be unable to stop it until the damage is done. The possibility has not been eliminated. It has been managed, mitigated, constrained by institutions and norms, and the accumulated wisdom of centuries of political experience, but it has not been eliminated. The Nero problem is not a historical curiosity. It is a permanent feature of governance by human beings, and the distance between the Roman Principate and any modern government is shorter than modern governments like to believe. There is one more dimension of Nero's legacy that requires attention, and it is a dimension that the ancient sources, for obvious reasons, could not have anticipated. Nero's story has been told and retold so many times in so many forms across so many centuries that the retellings have become a subject in their own right, a history of how history is used, distorted, adapted, and consumed. The medieval Nero was the Antichrist, a figure of theological terror, invoked in sermons and apocalyptic literature, as evidence that the forces of evil could penetrate even the highest offices of worldly power. The Renaissance Nero was a figure of fascinated horror, the subject of paintings by artists who found in his story the extremes of human behavior that their art required. The Enlightenment Nero was a political cautionary tale. The figure Gibbon and Montesquieu used to illustrate the dangers of unchecked authority. The 19th century Nero was a melodrama, the subject of novels and operas that emphasized the romantic elements of his story. The doomed love for Poppaea, the conflict with his mother, the fire, the fall. The 20th century Nero was a cinematic villain. Peter Ustinov in a toga, Charles Laughton wreathed in flames, the essential costume drama heavy whose excesses justified the spectacle of the film itself. Each version preserved some element of the historical Nero and discarded the rest. The theological Nero preserved the persecution and discarded the governance. The political Nero preserved the tyranny and discarded the art. The romantic Nero preserved the passion and discarded the calculation. The cinematic Nero preserved the spectacle and discarded the complexity. In every case, the needs of the medium and the moment determined which Nero survived and which was suppressed. The 21st century Nero, our Nero, the one we are constructing now, is characterized by a desire to complicate the simplifications of previous eras, to recover the ambiguity that the sources contain and that centuries of adaptation have smoothed away. This is partly a function of modern historiographical method, which is trained to interrogate sources rather than to accept them. It is partly a function of modern sensibility, which is suspicious of single-frame moral judgments, and which finds the category of pure villain as reductive as the category of pure hero. And it is partly a function of the current political moment, which has made the question of how democratic societies deal with autocratic personalities feel less like an academic exercise and more like an urgent practical concern. Whether our Nero is more accurate than the Neros of previous centuries is a question we are not well positioned to answer. We are inside our own moment. We cannot see our own biases with the clarity that we apply to the biases of Tacitus or Suetonius or the medieval church. What we can say is that the desire to complicate, to hold multiple interpretations simultaneously, to resist the closure of moral judgment, To sit with the discomfort of a figure who was both a reformer and a murderer, both an artist and a tyrant, both mourned and reviled, is itself a historical choice shaped by our moment as surely as the theological demonization was shaped by the 3rd century and the Enlightenment politicization was shaped by the 18th. Nero is, in this sense, a mirror. Every era that looks at him sees its own preoccupations reflected back. The Christians saw the Antichrist. The Republicans saw the tyrant. The Romantics saw the tortured artist. We see, what? The narcissist? The performer politician? The child of a dysfunctional family whose damage was amplified by power into civilizational catastrophe? The autocrat whose grip on reality dissolved because no one around him was willing or able to tell him the truth? All of these, probably, and none of them completely. The real Nero remains out of reach, not because the evidence is insufficient, though it is, but because every act of interpretation is also an act of self-reflection, and the interpreter cannot be separated from the interpretation. We will never see Nero as he was. We will only ever see Nero as we are. This is not a failure of historical method. It is the condition of historical method. The past is not a fixed object waiting to be photographed. It is a process, a continuous negotiation between the evidence that survives and the minds that encounter it. The Nero who exists in these pages is not the Nero who died in Phaon's villa. He is the Nero we have constructed from the wreckage of the sources, shaped by the questions we brought with us, limited by the things we cannot see about ourselves. We offer him not as truth, but as the best approximation of truth that the evidence and our limitations permit. If future generations find our Nero as partial and as revealing of our biases, as we find the Nero of Tacitus, they will be right. And the conversation will continue, as it has continued for 2,000 years, because the questions Nero's life raises about power, about art, about the relationship between private pathology and public catastrophe, are questions that do not expire. There is a final irony that deserves to be stated plainly, because it is the kind of irony that Nero himself, with his instinct for theatrical reversal, might have appreciated. The man who wanted above all things to be remembered as an artist was remembered instead as a monster. The art was lost. The poetry was lost. The compositions were lost. The vocal performances that he valued more than his empire, more than his family, more than his life, vanished into the air the moment the last note ceased, as all performances do, leaving behind nothing but the descriptions of people who were not listening to the music but watching the scandal of an emperor who dared to make it. And yet, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, that the Senate considered the most offensive expression of Nero's megalomania, the building that his successors buried under rubble and public works as a repudiation of everything he stood for, survived. The frescoes survived. The painted ceilings and the delicate arabesques and the mythological scenes that Nero's artists had created in the service of his aesthetic vision survived 15 centuries in the dark, unseen, unknown, preserved by the very act of burial that was meant to destroy them. When Renaissance artists descended into those buried rooms, they did not know they were entering Nero's palace. They knew only that they had found something beautiful, something that spoke to them across a gap of 1,400 years, with an immediacy that transcended the intervening centuries. The style they discovered there, the lightness, the grace, the playful integration of human figures and natural forms and architectural fantasy, became one of the foundational influences on Renaissance decorative art. It flowed from Raphael's workshop into the visual vocabulary of Western culture, where it remains visible in the decorative traditions of churches and palaces and public buildings from Rome to St. Petersburg to Washington. Nero's art survived, not the art he made with his voice. That was ephemeral, and ephemeral things do not survive. But the art he commissioned, the aesthetic environment he created, the visual world he built around himself as an expression of the sensibility he valued above all other things, it survived the damnation of his memory. It survived the burial of his palace. It survived 15 centuries of darkness and silence and forgetting. and when it emerged, it changed the visual culture of the civilization that had condemned him. He would have found this satisfying, probably. He would also have found it insufficient, because it was not his art, not the art he made with his own body and voice, not the art for which he had sacrificed everything. The commissioned frescoes were a setting, not a performance. They were the stage, not the song. And the song was what mattered. The song was always what mattered. The song is gone. We have the stage, we have the ruins, we have the hostile descriptions of performances we cannot hear, written by men who were not listening. We have the coins and the inscriptions and the archaeological remains and the literary accounts, and from all of this we can reconstruct the outlines of a life, the shape of a reign, the trajectory of a catastrophe. But the voice that Nero considered the truest expression of his identity, the voice for which he trained and dieted and exercised and performed and ultimately died, the voice is silence. 2,000 years of silence, the most personal, the most intimate, the most essentially Neronian element of his legacy is the one element that could not survive the medium in which it was produced. Stone endures, paint endures, words endure after a fashion, copied and recopied across centuries by hands that never knew the author. But a voice exists only in the moment of its utterance, and when the moment passes, the voice passes with it, and no amount of historical reconstruction can bring it back. Qualis artifex pareo. What an artist dies in me. The artist died. The question of what died with him, whether it was genuine talent or imperial self-delusion, whether the world lost something real or merely lost a powerful man's fantasy about himself, is a question the silence does not answer. And perhaps that is the most honest epitaph available to us. Not the judgment, not monster, not martyr, not misunderstood genius, not cartoon villain, but the silence itself. The space where a voice once was and is no longer. The absence that no amount of historical reconstruction can fill. But history does not end with absence. It ends with what persists. And what persists, in the case of Nero, is not what anyone involved would have predicted. Consider the coins. They are small things, of course, discs of silver and bronze and gold, each one light enough to hold between two fingers, each one stamped with a face that 2,000 years of soil and handling have worn to a suggestion rather than a portrait. They turn up in the strangest places. A denarius of Nero unearthed in a farmer's field in Suffolk, another in a drainage ditch outside Cologne, a third in the rubble of a market town in what is now Tunisia, mixed with pottery shards and animal bones and the ordinary detritus of a life lived 20 centuries ago. They circulated for decades after his death, the debasement he had ordered making them marginally less valuable than the coins of his predecessors, but not valueless enough to withdraw. And they traveled with the empire's commerce to every corner of the known world, carried in the pouches of merchants and soldiers and tax collectors who handled them without ceremony, who did not study the portrait or contemplate the man, who used them to buy bread and wine and passage on ships and the small daily transactions that constitute the real business of civilization. The coins are the most democratic record we possess. They were seen by millions of people who never read Tacitus, who never heard of Suetonius, who could not have located the Senate on a map. They were held by slaves and freedmen and provincial farmers and dock workers and the entire vast population of the empire that the literary sources render invisible. The face on the coin, that fleshy, slightly petulant face with its suggestion of a double chin and its carefully styled hair, was, for most of the empire's inhabitants, the only image of Nero they ever saw. It was their Nero. Not the Nero of the historians or the theologians or the senatorial gossips, but the Nero of the marketplace, the Nero of the tax receipt, the Nero of the daily transaction, a face on a coin, a guarantee of value, nothing more. The coins do not tell us what these people thought of him. They tell us only that he was present in their lives, present in the most mundane, most routine, most forgettable way possible, a weight in the hand, a face glimpsed and ignored. The most powerful man in the world, reduced to a medium of exchange, passed from palm to palm until the features blurred and the name became illegible, and the coin itself became just a piece of metal, its original meaning exhausted, its function complete. There is something clarifying about this. The literary record gives us a Nero of extremes, and the matricide, the arsonist, the artist, the antichrist. The coins give us a Nero of ordinariness, a face in a purse, a unit of commerce, a small, worn, unremarkable object that meant nothing to the person who held it, except that it could be exchanged for something they needed. The vast majority of the people who lived under Nero's rule experienced his reign not as drama, but as administration, as tax rates and grain prices and the relative stability or instability of the currency in which they conducted their daily business. For them, the question of whether Nero was a monster or a genius was as remote as the question of whether the gods were real. It did not affect the price of fish. This is not cynicism. It is proportion. The Nero who matters to the historian, the Nero of the murder and the fire and the persecution and the fall, is real, and his reality has consequences that extend far beyond the marketplace. But the Nero who mattered to most of the people alive during his reign was a different figure entirely. A distant authority whose policies affected their lives in ways they could feel but not always attribute, whose name they knew but whose face they knew only from the coins, whose dramas unfolded in a world so removed from their own that news of his death, when it reached the provinces, may have registered as little more than a change in the face on the next year's coinage. We build our histories from the exceptional. We remember the fire, the murder, the golden house, the singing emperor, the collapsing boat. We do not remember the grain shipments that arrived on schedule, the roads that were maintained, the legal disputes that were adjudicated, the 1,000 small competencies that kept a 1,000,000-person city functioning and a multi-continental empire solvent. These things do not make stories. They do not make moral arguments. They do not satisfy the human appetite for narrative, which demands conflict and resolution and a protagonist whose choices matter. But they were the substance of the reign and the thing that most people actually experienced, and their absence from the historical record is a distortion as significant as any bias in Tacitus. The corrective is not to rehabilitate Nero. The murders happened. The cruelty was real. The suffering of his victims, Agrippina, Britannicus, Octavia, Seneca, the Christians in the gardens, the senators tried and executed on fabricated charges, the uncounted others whose deaths were too routine to record, is not diminished by noting that the grain ships sailed on time. The corrective is to insist on complexity, to hold simultaneously the knowledge that a man who murdered his mother also reformed the tax code, that a ruler who persecuted the Christians also rebuilt a city with intelligent urban planning, that an emperor whose artistic pretensions scandalized the Senate also maintained peace on the Parthian frontier for the duration of his reign. These are not contradictions to be resolved. They are the actual texture of a human life lived at the intersection of enormous power and profound damage, and any account that smooths them into coherence in either direction, whether toward villainy or rehabilitation, is sacrificing truth for the sake of a neater story. Nero does not need a neater story. He needs the messy one, the real one, the one where the good and the terrible coexist without resolution, because that is how they coexisted in fact. And to pretend otherwise is to do what the ancient sources did, select the fragments that serve the argument and discard the ones that complicate it. The physical traces of his reign are scattered across 3 continents, and they tell a story that the literary sources do not always corroborate. In Britain, the province that Claudius conquered and that Nero administered during the early years of his reign, the archaeological record shows a period of significant investment in infrastructure, roads, forts, supply depots, that suggest competent provincial governance during the 50s and early 60s. The revolt of Boudica in 60 to 61, which nearly destroyed the Roman presence in Britain, was suppressed not by Nero personally, but by his appointed governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, acting with a military efficiency that reflects well on the administrative system that had placed him in command. The aftermath of the revolt, the punitive measures followed by a deliberate policy of reconciliation and reconstruction, bears the hallmarks of Seneca and Burrus's influence, a pragmatic blend of force and accommodation that kept the province stable for the remainder of Nero's reign. In Egypt, the papyri preserve a different Nero, an administrative presence whose edicts and appointments are recorded with the bureaucratic flatness of a functioning government. Tax records, legal proceedings, land surveys, the ordinary paperwork of provincial administration, these documents show an empire that continued to operate with professional competence regardless of what was happening in the palace in Rome. The Egyptian evidence is particularly valuable because it is entirely free of the literary biases that shape the historian's accounts. A tax receipt does not have an opinion about whether the emperor should have sung on stage. It records a rate, a date, a name, and moves on. In Corinth, the inscription commemorating Nero's liberation of Greece, the proclamation he made at the Isthmian Games in 67, survives in fragmentary form, and its language is revealing. The decree speaks of Nero's love for Greece, his admiration for Greek culture, his desire to honor the traditions of Hellenism by freeing the Greek provinces from the burden of Roman taxation. The language is grandiose, self-congratulatory, and entirely consistent with everything we know about Nero's character. But it is also, in its way, sincere, or at least sincerely felt in the moment of its delivery, which is all that any public pronouncement can claim. The Greeks who heard it responded with genuine gratitude. The inscription they erected in Nero's honor, before his fall, before the damnation of his memory required its defacement, praised him in terms that no Roman senator would have recognized as applicable to the same man. In Rome itself, the physical evidence of the fire and the rebuilding is extensive, and largely confirms the literary accounts. Excavations beneath the modern city have revealed layers of ash and destruction consistent with the fire of 64, followed by construction consistent with the building regulations that Nero imposed. The wider streets, the fire-resistant materials, the mandated courtyards, these are visible in the archaeological record, and they represent a genuine improvement in urban safety and livability. The city that Nero rebuilt was, by the material evidence, better designed and more resilient than the city that burned. This fact coexists with the fact that the rebuilding was financed by confiscation and currency debasement. Both are true, neither cancels the other. The Domus Aurea, excavated and partially restored over the past century, remains the most eloquent physical testimony to Nero's reign and the most ambiguous. The scale is staggering even in ruin. The painted rooms where they survive display a sophistication of technique and inventiveness of design that place them among the finest examples of Roman decorative art. The rotating dining room. Confirmed by archaeological excavation in 2009, its mechanism identified in the foundations beneath the Palatine was real. The engineering required to build it was considerable. The imagination required to conceive it was remarkable. And the moral context in which it was conceived. A palace built on land cleared by a fire that may or may not have been set for the purpose, financed by the extraction of wealth from provinces whose populations had no voice in the matter, ensures that admiration and revulsion remain permanently entangled. This is the Domus Aurea's final lesson, and perhaps the final lesson of Nero's reign, that beauty and exploitation are not opposites. They are collaborators. The finest art of the ancient world was produced by slave labor, commissioned by stolen wealth, housed in structures built on confiscated land. The frescoes that inspired Raphael were painted by artists whose names we do not know, working under conditions we cannot determine, for a patron whose crimes are documented in detail sufficient to make the beauty they created feel at times like an accusation. The accusation is not directed at Nero alone. It is directed at the system that produced him, a system in which the concentration of wealth and power in a single household enabled patronage on a scale that no democratic or distributed system could match, and in which the cost of that patronage was borne by populations who never saw the art, never entered the palace, never heard the music, and whose labor and taxes and suffering made it all possible. The Golden House is beautiful. The Golden House is a crime. These two statements describe the same building, and the civilization that produced the building, and in different forms every civilization since, has never found a way to make them compatible. We are nearly at the end now, and the temptation to resolve, to deliver a verdict, to close the case, to tell the audience what to think about Nero and send them home with the satisfaction of a judgment rendered, is strong. It is also for the reasons this entire account has been at pains to establish, a temptation that must be refused. Nero was not a good emperor. The evidence for this is extensive, consistent across multiple independent sources, and confirmed by the material record. He murdered members of his own family. He persecuted a religious minority for political convenience. He depleted the treasury. He neglected the provinces. He abandoned the business of governance for the pursuit of personal artistic validation. He created the conditions for a civil war that killed tens of thousands and destabilized the empire for a generation. These are not ambiguous findings. They are facts, established beyond reasonable dispute, and any account that fails to state them plainly is not being nuanced. It is being dishonest. But he was also not the figure that history has made of him. He was not the fiddling arsonist. He was not the one-dimensional sadist. He was not the cackling tyrant of the paintings and the films and the Sunday sermons. He was a person, a damaged, gifted, frightened, dangerous person who was given absolute power at the age of 16 by a mother who had killed to give it to him, who was educated by a philosopher who could not reconcile his own principles with the system he served, who was advised by men who told him what he wanted to hear because telling him what he needed to hear was a good way to die, and who spent 13 years on a throne he did not want, performing a role he was not suited for, in a system that had no way to remove him once it became clear that the performance was failing. The responsibility is his. The context is not an excuse. A man who murders his mother is responsible for the murder regardless of the circumstances that led to it. And the psychological damage of his childhood, the manipulations of Agrippina, the structural incentives of the Principate, the corrosive effects of sycophancy, none of these diminish the moral weight of the act itself. Nero chose. At every critical juncture, the poisoning of Britannicus, the murder of Agrippina, the execution of Octavia, the persecution of the Christians, the judicial murders of senators and former allies, Nero chose, or at the very least permitted the choice to be made in his name, which in a system of absolute authority amounts to the same thing. But the choices were made inside a system that produced them as reliably as a forge produces heat. The Julio-Claudian dynasty did not produce one Nero. It produced a succession of rulers, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, each of whom displayed in different combinations and degrees the pathologies that absolute power without institutional constraint tends to generate. Paranoia, cruelty, detachment from reality, the substitution of personal whim for political judgment, the inability to distinguish between loyalty and servility, between counsel and flattery, between governance and self-expression. These were not individual moral failures. They were systemic outcomes, the predictable results of placing unlimited authority in the hands of a single human being and then removing every mechanism by which that human being might be corrected, restrained, or replaced. Nero was the most vivid expression of the system's failure mode. He was not its cause. The distinction matters because the failure mode did not die with Nero. It recurred in Domitian, in Commodus, in Caracalla, in Elagabalus, in the long procession of emperors whose reigns demonstrated, again and again, that the Roman system could produce competent governance only when the accident of biology or the wisdom of adoption placed a competent person on the throne. And that when it failed to do so, the consequences were borne by everyone except the person responsible. This is the structural legacy of Nero's reign, and it is more important than the biographical one. The biographical Nero, the matricide, the artist, the tyrant, is a singular figure, unrepeatable in his specific combination of damage and power and talent. The structural Nero, the demonstration of what happens when a system concentrates authority without accountability, is a recurring phenomenon visible in every era and every political system that has failed to solve the problem of executive constraint. The problem remains unsolved. It has been mitigated by constitutions, by separations of power, by independent judiciaries, by free presses, by the accumulated institutional wisdom of societies that have learned through catastrophe that concentrated power requires concentrated restraint. But mitigation is not solution. The mechanisms can be weakened, the norms can be eroded, the institutions can be hollowed out from within by the same patient, incremental pressure that Nero's predecessors applied to the Roman Republic until the forms remained and the substance was gone. This is why Nero endures. Not because his story is dramatic, though it is. Not because his crimes are shocking, though they are. Not because the image of the singing emperor is indelible, though it is. Nero endures because the problem he represents has not been solved, and every generation that encounters his story recognizes, with varying degrees of comfort and alarm, that the distance between his world and theirs is measured not in centuries, but in the strength of the institutions that stand between them and the possibility he embodies. On a June morning in the year 68, in a freedman's villa in the hills northeast of Rome, a man with a blade in his throat looked up at a centurion and said, "Too late. This is fidelity." The centurion pressed his cloak to the wound. The blood soaked through. The morning light, filtering through the windows of a house that had never been designed to witness an event of this magnitude, fell on a scene of almost unbearable intimacy. A dying man, a helpless soldier, a handful of freedmen who had stayed when everyone else had fled, and the sound of horses in the courtyard. More soldiers, arriving too late to change anything, too late even to witness the moment of death, arriving only in time to see the body and to begin the long process of deciding what it meant. The body was cremated by his old nurse, Agloge, and by his former mistress, Claudia Acta, the freed woman he had loved in his youth before Poppaea, before the murders, before the fire, before the long spiral into the isolation that killed him. The two women performed the rites with their own hands. They wrapped the ashes in white robes and placed them in the family tomb of the Domitii on the Pincian Hill, overlooking the city he had rebuilt and the palace he had been forced to leave, and the empire that was, even as the ashes cooled, beginning to tear itself apart over the question of who would replace him. Act and Agloge, a freed woman and a nurse. These were the people who buried the emperor of Rome, not the Senate, which had declared him a public enemy, not the Praetorian Guard, which had abandoned him, not the generals or the governors or the priests or the thousands of courtiers who had filled his palace and applauded his performances and told him he was the greatest artist the world had ever produced. A woman who had loved him when love was still possible for him, and an old servant who had cared for him since he was a child. They were the ones who carried his ashes up the hill in the June heat and laid them in the dark. The tomb still exists, or the hill does at least, though the specific location of the burial has been lost, covered over by centuries of construction, its markers destroyed by the damnation of memory that the Senate imposed, and that time and neglect completed. Somewhere beneath the Pincian Hill, beneath the gardens and the roads and the foundations of buildings erected by people who did not know what lay beneath them, the ashes of the last Julio Claudian emperor rest in whatever darkness the earth provides. No pilgrim's visit, no monument marks the place. The flowers that the common people once laid on his grave have not been renewed in nearly 2,000 years. The city he rebuilt surrounds the hill on every side. Rome is still here. Not the Rome he knew, not the Rome of the Insulae and the Circus Maximus and the Temple of Vesta, but a Rome that carries his within it the way a living tree carries the rings of its earlier growth. The streets he widened are still wide. The building codes he imposed influenced the codes that followed. The Colosseum that his successors built on the site of his artificial lake still stands. Its arches open to a sky that has not changed since the morning he rode out of the city for the last time, barefoot, in the dark. heading for a death he could not bring himself to accomplish alone. The Domus Aurea sleeps beneath the Oppian Hill, its rooms still painted, its ceilings still gilded in the places where the gold leaf has not flaked away, its frescoes still depicting the mythology and the natural beauty that Nero's artists rendered with a delicacy that 2 millennia of burial have not entirely destroyed. Tourists descend into the chambers now, following the same path that Raphael's students followed 5 centuries ago, and they see what Raphael saw, the persistence of beauty in conditions that should have destroyed it. The paint has faded. The gold is mostly gone. The rooms are damp and dark and held together by modern engineering that the original builders would not have recognized. But the images remain, the figures and the flowers and the architectural fantasies still visible on the walls, still speaking across the centuries in a language that does not require translation. The art survived. The voice did not. The empire he shattered rebuilt itself and endured for 4 more centuries in the West and 15 in the East. The religion he persecuted conquered the civilization he ruled. The dynasty he ended was replaced by dynasties that learned from his failures and eventually reproduced them. The constitutional problem he exposed, the problem of power without accountability, of authority without constraint, remains 2,000 years later the central problem of governance, unsolved and perhaps unsolvable, managed but never eliminated, held in check by institutions whose strength is always provisional and whose erosion is always possible. He was 30 years old. He had ruled for 13 years. He had wanted to be remembered as an artist, and instead he was remembered as a warning. The warning has been heard and ignored and heard again and ignored again in a cycle that shows no sign of ending, because the conditions that produced Nero, the concentration of power, the seduction of flattery, the isolation of authority, the human tendency to mistake compliance for consent and silence for approval, are not historical conditions. They are permanent ones. They exist wherever power exists. They will exist as long as power exists. And in a freedman's villa in the hills above Rome, on a morning when the light came through the windows and the horses stamped in the courtyard and the blood pooled on the floor beneath a centurion's useless cloak, a man who had been emperor of the world died with a phrase on his lips that history has never quite known what to do with. Qualis artifex perio, what an artist dies in me. The artist died. The empire endured. The question endures longer than either. The question of what was lost and what was saved and whether the two can ever be distinguished. In a world where the same hand that creates the fresco signs the death warrant, where the same voice that sings the aria orders the execution, where beauty and power and cruelty are braided together so tightly that the attempt to separate them destroys all 3. The Pincian Hill is quiet now. The ashes have been silent for 2,000 years. The city moves around them, indifferent, alive, built on the ruins of the city that burned and the ruins of the city that was rebuilt and the ruins of every city that followed, layer upon layer, each generation building on the bones of the last, each inheriting the unresolved contradictions of the one before. The wind moves through the pines on the hill. Below in the streets, the coins have long since been replaced by other coins, bearing other faces, guaranteeing other values. The faces change. The metal changes. The guarantees expire and are renewed and expire again. But the weight of the coin in the hand, the small daily transaction, the exchange of labor for bread and bread for another day of living, this persists. This is what persists when the empires fall and the palaces are buried and the names on the monuments are chiseled away and the histories are written and rewritten and the dead are judged and judged again by courts that will themselves be judged by courts not yet convened. Somewhere beneath the hill, the ashes wait. They do not know they are waiting. They do not know that the world above them has spent 20 centuries arguing about the man they once were. They are calcium, andite, carbon, and mineral trace, indistinguishable from the soil that surrounds them, returned to the elements from which they were briefly borrowed, No longer an emperor, no longer an artist, no longer a monster or a mirror or a warning, just ash in the dark, under a hill in Rome. The wind does not remember, the stones do not remember. The city, sprawling and loud and ancient and new, carries his legacy in its bones without knowing his name. And somewhere, in a buried room beneath the Oppian Hill, a painted figure dances on a wall that no one was meant to see again, arms raised, garlands flying, frozen in a moment of joy that has outlasted the man who commissioned it, outlasted the empire that built it, outlasted the civilization that buried it, outlasted everything except the pigment and the plaster and the stubborn, silent persistence of something beautiful, made for a man who is gone, surviving in the dark, waiting for the light.